Chapter 1 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elaine Webb. 6 Years in the Prisons of England by a Merchant. Edited by Frank Henderson. Chapter 1. My Commercial Antecedents. How I got into prison. In the beginning of the year 1856, I commenced business on my own account as a merchant in the northern city. Previous to that time I had been engaged in an unsuccessful partnership, but I paid my creditors in full with the small capital advanced to me by my friends for the purpose of my new adventure. When I began operations, therefore, I was literally without a shilling in the world, but I had a spotless character, enjoyed good credit, and possessed a thorough knowledge of my business, advantages which I easily persuaded myself would enable me to succeed without the actual possession of capital. My business connections were scattered over various parts of the world, and generally ranked among the very best class of foreign merchants. I usually received orders by letter. Sometimes I gave open credits to houses whose orders I could not otherwise secure, but frequently I had remittances long before the merchandise could arrive at its destination. The trade was one of confidence, requiring both character and position for its development, and had I been prudent enough to confine myself strictly to this branch of the business, I would now, without doubt, have been a wealthy and successful merchant. At the end of my first year's operations, my ledger showed a satisfactory balance to my credit. The year 1857 opened auspiciously, and I continued to prosper almost to the end of it, when a storm swept over the commercial world, which involved hundreds of firms in bankruptcy and ruin. From the nature of my business, it was scarcely possible I could escape, and although I succeeded in avoiding bad debts, I incurred indirect losses to a very considerable amount. In May 1858, I paid a visit to the Continent in order to ascertain on the spot how my connections there had weathered the recent storm. This visit resulted in a large increase of legitimate business, and up to this point I had taken no false step. Shortly afterwards, however, I was induced to embark in two different and distinct branches of trade, which led to my ruin. The first was the manufacture of novelties, which, after a large expenditure, I was obliged to relinquish, in consequence of my not having sufficient capital to make it profitable. The second was a mercantile business, managed by an agent resident on the Continent. This agent was without means, and, as I afterwards found, without the abilities necessary for the position. He had not long commenced operations when a war broke out in Lombardy, which furnished his customers with an excuse for rejecting the goods they had ordered before prices began to recede. The consequence was that I had thousands of pounds worth of goods thrown upon my hands abroad, which resulted in large direct and still larger indirect losses. It was at this juncture that I ought to have stopped payment, but being of a sanguine disposition, and my regular business continuing to prosper, I hoped the successes in the one branch would balance the losses in the other, and I resolved to struggle on. I paid a second visit to the Continent about this time, which resulted in the formation of a partnership with my agent, the business to be carried on in his name. The new firm was debited with all the stock on hand at cost prices, and in all future business the profits were to be divided. I thought by giving my friend an interest in this branch of my business that I would lessen my losses on rejected stock and facilitate my escape from impending bankruptcy. I arranged to draw bills on the firm at 3 months' date, payable abroad, for such amounts as my partner could see his way to meet at maturity. I also had a private arrangement with my partner for obtaining what I called accommodation bills. These were in the form of promissory notes issued in my favour and payable in London by myself. They were not to enter into the books of the firm, and I was to be entirely responsible for them. I may here also explain that the partnership between me and my agent was not known, except to the customers of the firm abroad and to my own clerks at home. Thus, under the pressure of large obligations, I was not at the moment in a position to meet, joined to an extreme horror of the very idea of bankruptcy, involving as it did the loss of a lucrative and steadily increasing branch of my regular business. I resorted to an expedient to preserve my character and position, which I afterwards found the laws of my country declared to be a serious crime, to be expiated only by the complete and utter ruin of both. During all this time my private and social relations were without reproach. Neither was I without opportunity, gladly embraced, of doing good service to the trade with which I was connected, and also to my country. In the year 1860 I was chosen a director of the Chamber of Commerce in the city where my business was chiefly transacted. In connection with the international treaty between Great Britain and France, I was selected by my co-directors to classify and place average permanent values on the manufactures of the district, in order to regulate their admission under that treaty with France. I performed the task to the entire satisfaction of the Chamber, and was afterwards sent to Paris as one of a deputation appointed for the purpose of giving Mr. Cobden the most efficient aid toward the completion of his glorious and happily successful project. Owing to the very strong protectionist feeling on the part of the French manufacturers, great difficulties were encountered, but after the deputation had made 2 visits to Paris, they were finally overcome. It was universally acknowledged that if it had not been for the presence of practical men in Paris on that occasion, the treaty would have been completely inoperative, so far as concerned the important manufacturers which I as one of the deputation represented. For my share in these transactions I received the thanks of the Lords of the Committee of Privy Council for Trade, also the commemorative medal from the French government, with accompanying letter. Footnote 1. See Appendix. End of footnote 1. Acknowledging my services from M. Rouher, then Minister of Commerce and Agriculture at Paris. During my second visit to Paris in 1860, on public duty, I formed the resolution of breaking off my connection with the partner previously referred to, and of starting a business in Paris. I entered into negotiations with a gentleman highly recommended to me with a view to partnership, and received from my father the purpose of cash to assist me in my new undertaking. Once fairly clear of the losing branch of my business, I hoped very speedily to make up my previous losses, and the spring of 1861 was fixed upon for the opening of my Paris establishment, but my hopes were not destined to be realized. On looking into my affairs at the close of the year, I found, notwithstanding the satisfactory character and position of the legitimate branch of my business, and notwithstanding that my private expenditure did not amount to a 10th part of the profits on that branch, I had otherwise become almost hopelessly involved, and I accordingly resolved to stop payment. With this view I disclosed to my principal creditor my position and intentions. Taking the manager of the firm into my confidence, I informed him of the assistance I expected to receive from my father, and the hopes I entertained of the results of my Paris business when once in operation. The consequence was that the firm offered to forego 1,000L of their claim against me, and to give me occasional assistance in cash to meet any other engagements if I would continue to carry on my business. At this time I owed them about 10,000L, covered to a considerable extent by the accommodation bills I have already referred to. I must, however, explain that the character of these bills was known to the manager of the firm, and any banker or discounter could have readily satisfied himself as to their value by simply writing to the house in London where they were domiciled. There were many considerations urging me to accept the offer now made to me. The present of 1,000L, the probable success of my Paris business, the approach of my money-making season, joined to my horror of bankruptcy, all combined to induce me to alter my resolution to stop payment, and to inspire me with the hope that I would yet be able to retrieve my position and return my good name. In a fatal hour I yielded to the temptation, and closed with the proposals made to me, with the additional obligation that I was to pay off the 10,000L, due to the firm I have mentioned during the approaching season, and to give them good bills in exchange for the accommodation paper held by them. No sooner was this arrangement completed than I set about preparations for opening my Paris house. I refused to send any more goods to my old partner, and ordered him to wind up the business by the following May. I moreover resolved to have nothing more to do with accommodation bills, tore out all the leaves in my private letter book referring to these documents, a very fatal error, as I afterwards found, and exerted myself to pay off the claims of those of my creditors who knew my position. So well did I succeed that by the end of April I had reduced the 10,000L claimed to rather less than 5,000L, or rather to 4,000L, taking into account the 1,000L conceded by the firm previously mentioned. But before this I had begun to suspect that my friends did not mean to adhere to the arrangement I had entered into with them, one part of which was that they were to retire and return me the accommodation bills on getting good paper in their place. I had at this time placed good bills in their hands to the extent of 3,500L, but they refused to give up those they were intended to replace until they arrived at maturity. I began to fear that they would now compel me to stop payment just when they supposed I should be in possession of fresh funds for my Paris partnership, and at a time when, with the bills in their possession, which ought, according to agreement, to have been in mine, they could rank on my estate for about 7,000L, when with less than 4,000L I could have settled the account. This, by the way, is what they ultimately did, and had my estate yielded the respectable dividend they expected, instead of losing even the 1,000L they promised to concede to me, they would have been gainers to that amount by the operation. My transactions with this firm were in the position I have described when I started for the Continent with the view of opening my Paris business, and of winding up my previous unlucky partnership. This was the most successful journey I ever made. I visited Bremen, Hamburg, the interior of Germany, crossed through Switzerland to Loins, where I appointed to meet my French traveller, visited with him all the large towns in France, and with my pocket book full of valuable orders, I found myself in London in less than 4 weeks from the time I left home. I arrived in London on a Wednesday, and telegraphed to the firm to which I have referred that I would call on them personally on the following Friday morning, to settle their claim and receive the bills they ought to have returned before. On the Thursday evening, as I was preparing to leave the hotel for the railway station, I was suddenly and most unexpectedly arrested, and have not yet reached the spot I once loved to call my home.
End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. My feelings on entering prison, treatment and employment before trial, my trial and sentence. It is impossible to give the faintest idea of my state of mind on finding myself a prisoner. The circumstances of my arrest, while in the midst of my arrangements for a long night journey to Scotland, flushed with success beyond my most sanguine anticipations, and impatient to accomplish my freedom from a burden which had long oppressed me, and which had latterly threatened to utterly bear me down, gave an overwhelming force and severity to the shock. Indeed, the sudden and undreamt of change in my destination, the sharp and complete extinction of all my hopes and plans, stunned me for the time, and I felt it must be a hideous dream. I refused to credit the evidence of my senses. The detective's touch which still burned upon my arm, the words of arrest which still rang in my ears, his actual presence by my side, were but false creations of the mind. I continued to think, as I walked along in that strange company, that I must still be on my way to the railway station, that I saw the glare of the lights, and mingled in the bustle of the platform, when the dark outline of a London lock-up met my bewildered eyes. We entered its grim and silent gates. The cell door was closed behind me, the lock was turned, and I and the reality were left alone. About that dark cheerless cell, its cold bare walls, its grated windows, its massive door, there was to me an awful certainty. In an access of astonishment and grief I threw myself on the solitary bench, for they had not sought to mock my misery with the presence of a bed, and as thoughts of my wife and friends came upon me, I covered my face with my hands and wept. How long that flood of hot and bitter tears continued, I know not, but they particularly relieved my almost bursting head. I arose and in the darkness paced my prison floor. Even in these terrible hours, hope did not utterly forsake me. The swift revolution of fortune's wheel had indeed left me crushed and mangled in its track, but I was not actually ground to powder. As I became more familiar with the reality of my situation, I began to take a calmer and more hopeful view for the future. As morning dawned, I had almost persuaded myself that I had only to see the manager of the firm who held the bills, for uttering which I had been arrested, and make certain explanations and proposals to regain my liberty. With impatience, therefore, I awaited the hour, which I knew must come, when I would be removed from London to Scotland, and when, at last, the detective who was to accompany me opened my cell door, I almost welcomed him as a friend. We booked at Euston Square Station for the place which I intended to have gone to, under such widely different circumstances, the previous evening. My guardian performed his duty during this long and painful journey with kindness and consideration, and did not propose to put handkerchiefs upon me. Arrived at our destination, I was marched through the police and sheriff's office to the common prison, and, to my utter astonishment and dismay, was prohibited for 9 or 10 days to have any communication with my friends. The single ray of hope which had sustained me on my weary journey and illuminated my darkest hour was thus pitilessly excluded, and for the first time since my arrest, I began to realize my true position. When I learnt that my arrest and incarceration in jail was noticed in all the newspapers, I felt that I was utterly and hopelessly ruined. No language could describe the anguish I endured as I thought of my wife and friends, of the disgrace and humiliation which I had brought upon them, and of the separation, worse than death itself, which was in store for us. Yet, strange as it may appear, amid all the mental torture I then and afterwards endured, I also experienced a certain sense of relief in my mind from considerations which would scarcely be expected to operate on one in my situation. Those only who have been in difficulties in business, who have borne the ceaseless strain on body and mind, which the burden of obligations, each day rushing forward with ever increasing velocity for liquidation, entails upon those who are honestly striving to stem the ebbing tide of torture, can fully understand how relieved I felt at the thought that I had no longer any bills to pay. Then a strong sense of indignation toward my prosecutors mingled with the wild and bitter current of my thoughts, and prevented me from being overpowered and destroyed. It was now but too clear to me that I was the victim of premeditated and heartless scheme, the successful issue of which was to protect my creditors from loss indeed, but to involve me in utter ruin. I saw with feelings I cannot and dare not utter, and which I now confess it was sinful in me to cherish, that they had lured me on to the centre of a great sea of ice, that they had, with their opportunity came, broken it around me, and left me alone and helpless to struggle against the inevitable doom. 3 of the 6 long, weary months during which I waited for trial were thus passed in a state of agony bordering on the madness of despair. The hours seemed magnified into days, and the weeks into years, and as they dragged their slow length along, my mental anguish received a new and terrible ally. Although I was as yet in the eye of the law an innocent man, the miserable allowance of oatmeal which constituted my chief food, and which was in all respects inferior to the penal diet of the worst behaved convict I ever met with in the English prisons, became loathsome to me, and the pangs of hunger were added to the mental torture I had till then alone endured. My cup of misery was surely filled to the brim. With the recollection of what I suffered then, burnt as it were with a hot iron on my memory, I thank Almighty God that no fiend was ever permitted, even in my worst and weakest hour, to whisper suicide to my ear. But I now can understand how some have listened to the fell deceiver and welcomed him, as friend and deliverer, to their arms. Fortunately for me, my early training and subsequent mode of life preserved me from any thought of this fatal solution to the problem of my life. I read my Bible almost constantly, although my reading seemed only to add to the bitterness of my regrets and self-reproaches. These questions would constantly suggest themselves to me. Could I ever have been a Christian? And what will the enemies of Christianity think and say about my fall? Until one day about noon, as I was gazing through the window of my lonely cell, I saw, or fancied I saw, a solitary star, and my thoughts were gradually lifted from the cross of suffering to the throne of mercy, and, let philosophers and theologians explain it as they may, instantaneous peace of mind followed the sight, or fancied sight, of that noontide star. The load was removed which threatened to crush my brain into lunacy. The salt surf waves of bitterness were stilled, and within me there was peace. The preparations for my approaching trial now occupied the principal share of my attention. I had already consulted a solicitor, and without telling him the whole of my case, I learned from him that I could not be tried at all if the continental witnesses refused to come to Scotland. So advised, I began to flatter myself with the belief that my case would ultimately be abandoned for lack of evidence. I certainly wished that my late partner would come over and testify to my partnership with him, which would have cleared my name from dishonour so far as related to the bills with which we were jointly concerned, but knowing there were other bills of a similar character of which he knew nothing, I thought it would be useless to attempt to clear myself on one set of bills when I was unable to do so on them all, and I consented to my friend being instructed by my solicitor to remain at home, as of course it was of the last importance to me that the witness in connection with the other set of bills should also be absent. My solicitor wrote to them to the same effect. I will here explain the reasons which induced me at this crisis to adopt a course which many of my readers, no doubt, will regard as an attempt to defeat the ends of justice. I did not for a moment desire to justify myself with regard to the bills in question. To utter bills of exchange for which no real value has been given is not justifiable, however common it may be, and to tender such bills in exchange for merchandise and dishonour them at maturity is flagrant dishonesty. Whatever may have been the amount of my guilt, of the intention to defraud any man, I was as innocent as an unborn child. If I had had any such intention, the bankruptcy court would have been the safe and easy way to gratify it. Neither in these transactions did I ever suppose that I was offending the statute law of the country, since by the exercise of the same caution which enabled, and still enables, other men to tread very closely upon, but never to overstep, the limits of legality, I too might have kept myself secure from criminal prosecution. I considered myself justified, therefore, in availing myself of such means as were in my power to evade the operation of laws I had never consciously violated. But in all this I may have been, and probably was, in error. I have no wish to extenuate or explain away any fault or crime of which I may have been guilty. I choose rather the language of penitence and confession, and although I may never perhaps be forgiven by society, I shall cherish the hope of being more mercifully dealt with by him who said, with reference to a greater sin than mine, "Go and sin no more." Thus the days and weeks passed away, while I still hoped and believed that no one would appear to witness against me. The prison diet now, however, began to tell seriously upon me. In England and America, I believe a prisoner is allowed to maintain himself under certain restrictions whilst he is waiting for trial, but in Scotland he is compelled to subsist on a diet which is considered the main ingredient in the punishment of the very lowest class of offenders whose sentence do not exceed a few months' imprisonment. The sense of punishment involved in this treatment, which would kill me now, was to some extent forgotten in the greater mental suffering I then endured, but the pangs of hunger and painful dreams about food frequently compelled me to think of my health. On making a complaint to the medical officer of the prison, he told me that as I was in good health, he could only give me the choice of coffee and a slice of bread in lieu of the oatmeal breakfast. But on seeing the small quantity of bread I was to be allowed, compared with the bulk of the oatmeal porridge, I decided on not changing for the worse. I did not wish to be treated differently from other prisoners, and therefore did not appeal to any higher authority. Indeed, I then imagined that as I was stronger and heartier than the majority of my miserable companions, I could subsist upon a meagre diet as well, if not better, than they. I now know from experience that I was wrong in this opinion, and that the man of strong digestion, accustomed to a generous diet, is likely to sustain more injury to his health by a sudden change to a very low scale of dietary than those of weak digestion who have not been accustomed to any other. The only concession made to me was a slight addition to the time for exercise in the open air cribs provided for that purpose. My legs, accustomed to much exertion, began to get stiff, and after I had been incarcerated for 4 or 5 months, one of my ankles occasionally pained me. The day fixed for my trial at last drew nigh, and so confident had I become that I should be liberated without a trial, that I had my clothes packed and ready to take abroad with me. I intended to leave the country for ever, and seek a new home in a distant land, where the prejudices of friends and society would not debar me from all the channels of honour and usefulness. I was removed a few days previous to the fixed date for my trial to the prison in the city, where it was appointed to take place, and I then had my first experience of handcuffs. At length the eventful morning arrived that I was led to believe would set me free. I entered the court with a beating heart, and was placed in the dock between 2 policemen. I felt ashamed to lift my head or to look around me, but I had seen as I entered that space open to the public was crowded with the better class of citizens. The judges, of whom there were 3, soon appeared and took their seats upon the bench, and began conversing with each other upon my indictment. One of them was overheard saying, "It would be a very difficult case to prove." Meanwhile some consultation was taking place amongst the legal gentlemen in front of me, when my agent and counsel came, and for the first time informed me that my trial might take place without the continental witnesses, and that supposing I was acquitted I could be tried again on 2 of the bills, that already there was a warrant out against me, and I should be arrested a second time on leaving the dock. The Crown was willing, however, they said, to accept a limited plea of guilty, that I would be sentenced to only a few months' imprisonment, no longer perhaps than I would have to endure in suspense, awaiting a second and perhaps a third trial, and that it would be better for me to tender the plea of guilt the Crown was willing to accept. This advice, so unexpected and so different from what I had formerly received, given at the very last moment, had the effect of entirely unhinging my mind, and for the moment I seemed paralysed. Of this I was conscious, however, that the continuance of suspense, that the most painful of all suffering, combined with the compulsory oatmeal treatment of remanded Scottish prisoners, would kill me. Still I could not bring myself to utter the words placed in my hands for that purpose. I waited and hesitated, and wondered where the jury were, and why they were giving me so long to consider before going on with the business of the court. Time seemed to have been given me on purpose to confuse my mind, for the longer I pondered the more bewildered I became. At last, like a child who does almost mechanically as his parents bid it, I read from the paper these words: "I plead guilty to uttering 2 bills of exchange, knowing them to be fictitious." The judge in the centre asked the counsel of the Crown if he accepted the plea, and on getting an answer in the affirmative, he whispered a second or 2 with his brother judge, whose son I believe prepared the case against me, and then pronounced sentence of penal servitude for a term of years that then seemed eternity to me. I was removed from the court to the prison, stripped of my clothes, clad in the garb of the convict, and turned into a cell there to writhe in tearless agony, and to indulge in bitter and unavailing regrets. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. 3 months in a Scottish prison. Begin my study of the convict and his surroundings. An old jailbird, a soldier, an innocent convict, my first cracksman acquaintance, conspiracy to murder an officer and escape, my removal to England. The paroxysm of grief and indignation which followed my return to prison gradually subsided, and after a few days I became in some measure resigned to my fate, and determined as far as possible to make the best of it. Indeed, in some respects, the change in my circumstances was for the better. The oatmeal treatment, it is true, was still continued, but with this difference that I now got more of it, and a still further and most welcome addition of a pennyworth of good milk and a pennyworth of eatable bread per diem. I remained on this diet during the 3 months and a half which elapsed before I was removed to England. Footnote 2. Perth, where the diet is more liberal, was not then opened for convicts. End of footnote 2. Unfortunately, during this time, my stomach, though craving for animal food, would not accept the oatmeal, or chief portion of my diet, and accordingly I was in the practice of dividing it amongst my fellow prisoners. I mentioned my case to the medical officer, but had to rest content with a little quinine and the assurance that I would be sent to England in a day or 2, where I would get a few ounces of animal food daily. To add to my troubles, one of my ankles began to swell, but after some time, and by the application of flannel bandages, the swelling decreased and the limb seemed quite sound again. These were not encouraging circumstances, however, under which to commence a long period of imprisonment, the less so as from what I had observed, I feared that in the event of illness I should have to submit to a very limited amount of medical attendance, probably in consequence of being frequently imposed upon by the prisoners and having private practice to attend to, doubtless of a more remunerative character. The medical officer was exceedingly rapid in his progress through the prison, and not more so in that than in his diagnoses and prescriptions. With the pangs of hunger consequently gnawing within me, and the dread of bad health and a ruined constitution haunting me day and night, I endeavoured by constant occupation to obtain some mitigation of my sufferings. I read all the books I could get hold of, wrote farewell letters to friends, hoping and believing that I would be sent to Western Australia, as it was then the practice to do with all healthy convicts of my own age who had received similar sentences. I also seized every available opportunity of conversing with the old lags or convicts about prison life, and it was here I received my first lessons in slang and thiefology, and began my study of the convict and his surroundings. But I could not yet think of myself as a convict. I had the usual prejudice, or rather horror of the species, entertained by the middle class, and declined to accept the offer, made in kindness, of having a neighbour in the same cell with me. I was compelled, however, to take exercise for some minutes every day, together with another prisoner, and I was usually best pleased when I had happened to be put into the same crib with one who had been a convict before. It was during these daily rounds that I witnessed with sadness the evil effects of sending boys or lads to prison for a few days or weeks for some petty theft, and placing them in constant contact and association with the habitual and reputed scoundrel and ruffian. These men were always willing to make a convert, and they generally succeeded, for the battle is half won ere they bring their forces on the field. It is here that the juvenile offender is nursed in villainy. Here he learns the inducements to crime, and from the lips of the hardened and experienced ruffian he hears of exploits and deeds of darkness, which inflame while they pollute his imagination, and he longs to be free that he might add some daring feat of wickedness to the catalogue he has heard. There can be no doubt that the indiscriminate associations of all grades of criminals is one of the most prolific sources from whence our convict prisoners receive their constant and foul supply. It was in one of these open-air cribs that I was initiated into the mysteries of prison politics and prison slang, for the convict has his policy as well as the government, and also his official, or rather professional, nomenclature, in which he enshrouds its meaning. To be an adept in prison politics is, first of all, to know and understand all the prison rules and regulations, not for purpose of obedience, but evasion; to discern the disposition and habits of the prison officers, with the view of conciliating or coercing them into trifling privileges or concessions; to know the various methods of treatment, diet, and discipline at the different prisons, and the character and disposition of their governors; to contrive to be sent to the prison which is supposed to be the most comfortable, and to know when and where good conduct and bad conduct will be productive of the best results in the way of removal or remission of sentence. In my solitude, and with the prospect before me of a long experience of such company, these conversations with my fellow prisoners possessed a certain kind of interest for me. I was also always eager to learn as much as I could of their previous history, and the cause of their imprisonment. One day, as I was taking my daily outdoor exercise, I observed an old man in a convict dress cleaning the prison windows a short distance from me, and I asked my neighbour in the crib who he was. "Oh, that's a beauty," said he. "He was walking down the street lately, along with another chum like himself, when a gentleman noticed them and asked them into a photographer's to get their portraits taken, and gave them a shilling each, as being the two ugliest specimens of the human race he had ever seen." "How long has he been in prison?" I inquired. "Goodness knows," he exclaimed. "I think about 8 or 29 years, and the longest sentence he ever had, except the first, was 60 days. "What are his offences usually?" "Oh, nothing but kicking up rows in the streets, or smashing a window. Last time it was for a fight with a poor man with a large family. He got up the fight on purpose, and as both were about to be apprehended, he says to the man he was fighting with, 'Jack, give me £half-a-crown, and I'll swear all the blame on myself.' Poor Jack was glad to accept the offer, so when they were taken before the magistrate, the old beauty said, 'Please, sir, it was me that assaulted that man, and as I am entirely in the fault, I hope you will give me all the punishment.' So Jack got out rejoicing, and the beauty got in, chuckling over his £half-a-crown, and speculating on the feast he would get with it when his 60 days expired." "How long does he generally remain out of prison?" I then inquired. "Why," said my friend, 2 days is a long time for him. If he is beyond that time, he will come to the prison and beg a meal." "Why does he not go to the poorhouse?" I asked. "Because he is more accustomed to the jail, and likes it better. He is generally employed in cleaning windows and other parts of the prison, and he likes a lark with the prisoners, most of whom he knows. Finding my companion so communicative, I continued my inquiries, and asked him, "What young fellows are these in the next cell?" "They have both been in the army," he replied. "One of them committed a small forgery. I think he forged the captain's order for some boots. He expected to get legged, Footnote 3, penal servitude, end of footnote 3, and get out of the army, but he has been sucked in. They only gave him a few months' imprisonment, and he will have to go back to his regiment again when his time's up. His brother's now at Chatham doing a 4 years' legging, but he hasn't to go back again to the army. This fellow swears he'll commit another crime as soon as he gets out." Whether this threat of committing another crime was carried out or not, I cannot tell, but in the earlier years of my imprisonment I came in contact with several prisoners who had committed offences for the purpose of getting out of the army. Of late years I have not met with any having been perpetrated with that motive. Noticing a delicate, melancholy-looking young man opposite to us, I inquired who he was. "Oh, I pity that man very much," said my friend. "He has got a sentence of 21 years penal servitude, and is as innocent of the crime as the child unborn." "How do you know he is innocent?" I asked in amazement. "The guilty man has turned up now that they cannot punish him, and confessed." Shortly after this conversation took place, I had an opportunity of learning from the lips of one of the principal offenders in the case for which this young man was unjustly punished, the following particulars in reference to it, which I give in my informant's own words. "I and other 2 miners like myself went to a horse race a few weeks ago. Towards evening we got a little on the spree, and I asked my 2 chums to come along and see a woman of my acquaintance. This woman was kept by a gentleman in the neighbourhood, but this was only known to a few. She was about 40 years of age, and although she was supposed by some to be fast, I knew long before that she was loose. Well, as we were all enjoying ourselves in this woman's house, who should come in but her brother, and so, to clear her character with him, she swore a rape against us. But the worst of it was, that poor married man there got convicted instead of one of us. When we ran from the house, the other fellow slipped out from us, and after we got away a bit, we met the married man. As we were chatting together we were all 3 arrested. The woman, it seems, had an ill will either to that man or his wife, and she swore against him on that account, and we have all 3 got 21 years apiece. I was glad to hear afterwards that this man got his liberty after suffering 6 months' imprisonment, but had it not been for great exertions on the part of his friends, he would have had to pay the full penalty. I have known, in the course of my prison experience, about a dozen well authenticated cases of innocent convictions, but only 2 of them succeeded in getting a pardon, the one after enduring about 18 months' imprisonment, the other a shorter period, but strange to say his pardon arrived on the very day of his death in prison. I have generally observed in cases of rape and crimes of that kind, when the female was advanced in life, that the crimes were not so black in reality as they were represented in the newspapers, and that the offenders, if not made actually worse in prison, would be more easily cured than the thief genius, who require special, and, as I think, very different treatment to that which they now receive. In this prison I also made the acquaintance of a professional cracksman, or burglar. He was a man of fair education, good appearance, and considerable natural ability, much above the average of his professional brethren. He had been living luxuriously in London on the fruits of his professional industry and skill. Till now he had escaped all punishment, with the exception of a few months' imprisonment for a mistake committed at the outset of his professional career. In answer to my inquiries as to his case, he volunteered the following information. "A few weeks ago, one of my pal's companions showed me the advertisement of a Scottish jeweller, wherein he boasted of his safe having successfully resisted the recent efforts of a gang of burglars. I said to my pal, 'Get Bob, and let us go down to-morrow by the mail train to Scotland, and we will see what this man's safe is like.' We all three came down here a few weeks ago, inspected the jeweller's premises, and decided on doing the job through an ironmonger's shop at the back. We had got the contents of the ironmonger's till, and were just through the intervening back wall when the copper policeman heard us and signalled for another bobby to come and help him. Out I sprang and had a fight with the policeman, and got knocked down insensible. My pal bolted and got off. Bob and I got copped. Caught. And as we had first-class tools on us, new to the authorities here, they have given it us rather hot." "Do you think you could have opened the safe? I understand those patent locks are very difficult to pick," I remarked. "Oh," said he, "I would not waste time trying to pick the lock. Drill a hole and get in the jack, and I can bring power to bear on it sufficient to open any safe. The great thing is to be able to get the time. The work I can easily do. Then Bob, my pal, is one of the best blacksmiths in England, and as true as steel. I always take him with me in a job of that sort." It so happened that I had a very good opportunity of proving that the burglar's high opinion of his pal's ability was not without foundation. On our removal to England, the cracksman was leg-ironed to me as an additional security against his making his escape. There were 5 couples beside ours, and after we arrived at our destination, and whilst the prison blacksmith was engaged hammering and punching off my irons, Bob, with a smile of contempt at his efforts, took up some tools that lay beside him, and liberated the other 5 couples before the blacksmith had freed me and my clever companion. The chief incident which occurred during my imprisonment in Scotland was a conspiracy among the convicts to murder the night officer and make their escape in a body. I was not considered safe for the job, and knew nothing of it until it had miscarried. The chief conspirator was my friend the cracksman, who made tools out of portions of his bedstead that opened not only the lock of our own cell, but that of every other cell in the prison if required. The prisoners were generally in couples in each cell at that time, and the plan agreed upon was as follows. One of the convicts was an old man subject to fits, and it was arranged that he was to feign a fit for the occasion. The assistance of the night officer was to be called, who was to have his light put out by the fellow prisoners of the one in fits, who was a strong muscular fellow. Meanwhile the cracksman, whose cell was opposite, was to unlock the cell doors of all the prisoners in the plot. This dark and desperate scheme was frustrated, however, by a little lad, who had heard 2 of the convicts conversing about it. His term of imprisonment expired on the day preceding the night fixed for the accomplishment, and he gave information to the governor, who placed officers with firearms in the ward all night. Next morning the suspected prisoners were searched, and the lock-picking instruments were found on the cracksman, and there the affair ended. The only result which followed the discovery of the plot, so far as I could discover, was that they were removed from this prison to England rather earlier than we otherwise should have been. Previous to our removal, the governor, who was a very sensible man, compared with those under whom I was afterwards placed, told me that I was about to be sent to England along with some of the worst characters he had ever known, that they were all leaving the prison with the character of conspirators, except myself, that he had given me the best character he could give to any prisoner, and that he hoped and believed I would reap the benefits attaching to good conduct, and be liberated long before my companions. But I was not born under a fortunate star. Almost all my companions had longer sentences than I had. Bob and the cracksman had 2 years longer, but as they managed to secure the convict's prize, they were sent out to Australia, and were liberated, I believe, 2 years before me. Some prisoners with sentences twice as long as mine were also liberated earlier than I was, and I remember alluding to this circumstance in a letter to my friends, written when I had been about 4 years and a half in imprisonment, and for doing so my letter was suppressed. The night of my departure for England at last arrived, and I found myself for the first time placed in heavy leg irons, along with 11 others. We were put into the prison van for the railway station, and as soon as we were seated in the carriage there commenced a scene which baffles all description. Some of my fellow prisoners commenced shouting, some screamed and laughed, others mocked and jeered, whilst above all curses loud and deep hurtled through the stifling air, and made the night hideous with the sound. The yells and oaths still ring in my ears, and that which was to my companions a scene of the utmost jollity and mirth, which was to me the dearest approach to hell my imagination had ever conceived. It was a cold spring night that witnessed my degrading departure. When I arrived at my destination in Yorkshire, one of my legs was considerably swollen. It is a cold spring night now. That swollen limb has for years been in the tomb, and the dismembered trunk on its ticket of leave has not yet returned to its long-lost home. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. My arrival at the Yorkshire prison. In simpliciter naturalibus. Get animal food. Medical treatment. Status Christianity. Removed to the hospital. Death of a prisoner. My leg gets much worse. Removal to Surrey prison. On my arrival at the Yorkshire prison, I and my companions were subjected to a new and to me most painful operation. I am quite well aware that it would be next to useless, if not quite hypocritical, in one in my position to lay claim to any considerable delicacy of feeling, or to appear to be over-scrupulous in matters of common decency, but there will occasionally, however, be found even amongst convicts those who will bear a pretty long period of imprisonment, during which they are subjected to a variety of contaminating influences, and yet not have their moral sensibilities completely destroyed. Of these I was one, and I felt that the treatment which I had now to undergo was conceived in a barbarous spirit, and was well fitted to destroy utterly any feelings of self-respect which my previous experiences had still left me. Every part of my body was minutely inspected immediately on my arrival, in order that I might not take any money or tobacco into the prison. Doubtless it is very desirable, and even necessary, that every precaution should be taken to prevent such articles finding their way into prisons, at least on the persons of prisoners, but the fact remains that, notwithstanding these inspections, both money and tobacco do find their way into prison, and are every day in common use amongst the prisoners. Prisoners will have tobacco, and tobacco cannot be got without money, so that both must be obtained, and the result has been that the more rigorous the inspection, the greater the ingenuity required to evade it. The trials of skill and invention which goes on between the convict and the inspector, like those between artillery and iron plates, have as yet only proved that, given the power of resistance, the power of overcoming it will be found. One of my fellow prisoners verified the truth of this conclusion by taking 5 sovereigns into prison with him, notwithstanding all the care and experience exercised by the inspector. I now got the first taste of animal food I had had for about 10 months. So keen was my appetite that I could have relished any cooked carrion even, if it had come in my way. I also got potatoes, the very skins of which I devoured with great gusto. It was very curious that at this time I preferred salt to sugar, or anything that was sweet, and I used to suck little lumps of salt for the first few days I had the opportunity of doing so, with as much relish as children do their sugar plums. The bread at this prison was excellent, and the food generally of good quality. The day after my arrival I was ordered to strip the second time for the medical inspection, and as a considerable time elapsed before my turn came, I had to remain standing in that state with my swollen leg rather longer than it was good for me. When the inspection was concluded, my leg was ordered to be bandaged, and some medicine was given to me daily. I now had my hair cut in the approved prison fashion, and was put into a cell to sew mats, in a standing posture. In this employment, relieved by a short period of daily out-of-door exercise, I passed one of the 3½ months I was in this prison. The 2 chaplains before whom I was taken shortly after my arrival were extremely kind to me during the whole time I remained. One of them had done much good among the prisoners, and had been of great service to many of them by getting them employment after they were liberated, thus removing the greatest obstacle in the way of a permanent reformation of the prisoner. I recollect the first Sunday I spent in this prison. I was very nearly getting reported to the governor for a very unintentional violation of the prison rules. In accordance with these rules, convicts were not allowed to turn their heads in any direction in chapel, and if they did so they were taken by the attendant officer before the governor, who punished them for disobedience. I cannot but suppose that those who framed these rules had some good end in view, in being so stringent in the matter of posture in the religious service. The difficulty with me was to discover whether the spiritual welfare of the prisoners, or the preservation of a more than military discipline amongst them, even in matters of religion, had appeared to them to be of the greater importance. It is probable, however, that neither of these considerations decided the question, but that the principal object of these regulations was to preserve in the convict mind, even in the act of worship, the idea of punishment in a perfectly lively and healthy condition. Be that as it may, on my first Sunday in chapel, with my English prayer book before me, which was then quite new to me, I found myself quite unable to follow the chaplain in the services in which he was engaged, and to which I was also a perfect stranger. Turning over the leaves of the prayer book, in the vain attempt to find out the proper place, and happening to cast my eyes over the shoulder of the prisoner in front of me in order to find it, the movement caught the eye of the officer, who sat watching every face, and I saw from his stare, and the frown which gathered under it, that I had committed a grave offence. Immediately I resumed my proper attitude, and sat out the service as rigid as my neighbours, and so escaped the threatened punishment. Only on one other occasion did I transgress the prison rules. While at work I felt the pain in my leg become almost insupportable, and in order to relieve it I took rest, although still continuing to sew. For doing so I received a short reprimand. The state of my leg now became a cause of great anxiety to me, and rendered my outdoor exercise a source of pain, instead of a means of relief from the monotony of my prison occupation. This exercise was taken in a circle, keeping a certain number of yards distance from another prisoner, and we were forbidden to speak or even to look around. Once or twice during the period of exercise we had to run instead of walk. The running I found very painful and injurious to my leg, and I petitioned the doctor to be excused from it, but was refused. There was nothing for it but to hop along, every step giving me great pain, until one day I made a false step, the consequences of which compelled me to give up walking altogether. My knee became inflamed, and I was ordered to lie in my hammock in my cell. Some pills were prescribed for me, which I soon found, from the state of my gums, contained mercury. As I knew that the cause of my complaint was the want of proper nourishment, I fancied the doctor had mistaken my case when he prescribed for me, and I ventured to speak to him about it. He did not appear pleased at my making any allusion to medicine. The pills were discontinued, but I was put on a change of diet for a month, which consisted in taking away my meat, soup, and potatoes, and giving me instead a dish of what was by courtesy termed arrow root, but which the prisoners more accurately designated cobbler's paste. Under this regime it will readily be believed my condition every day became worse, and at last, after being nearly 2 months confined to my cell, I got the order of removal to the hospital. I remember, oh, how well, with what pain I crawled to it on all fours, and slid downstairs on my back without any assistance. In this way I managed to reach the sick room, and the first object that attracted my attention on entering was a convict at the point of death. A stream of blood was rushing from his mouth, which choked him just as I was placed in the next bed. Another convict, a Scotch shepherd, had died only a few days previously, from the effects of the treatment he received in the Scotch prisons previous to his trial. I may here mention that I met with several instances of deaths occurring in English prisons in consequence of the treatment the prisoners had received before trial in Scotland. In the majority of these cases the period of detention before trial was 6 or 7 months. I also heard of one case, which did not come within my own observation, however, where the prisoner who died was innocent of the crime with which he was charged, and that his widow intended to prosecute the authorities for damages. Whether she did so or not, I never learned. For about a month I lay in this hospital, but no improvement could be reported in the state of my health. In addition to the physical pain I endured, I was prey to the most acute mental agony. I could feel that my originally strong constitution was being gradually undermined, and that the poison of disease which would never be eradicated from my system was, through ignorance or negligence, slowly and surely increasing within me. And then the possibility of losing my limb altogether was a thought which now and again forced itself upon me, and made the warm blood curdle in my veins. All this time I knew, and the knowledge gave me additional poignancy to my sufferings, that with care and proper surgical treatment I could easily have been cured. But I dared not open my mouth in the way of suggestion or complaint. I had already been taught by bitter experience the folly of that. Through all the hours of my imprisonment I had learned to look forward through the darkness of my near future to the day of my liberation as to a bright unsetting star. Its clear white ray pierced the clouds which hung dark and heavy over me, and shed light and hope within me, for it told me that behind these clouds there was light, and a day which would yet dawn upon me, wherein I could work and redeem the past. But now the strong bright spirit of hope appeared to have forsaken me. As I lay upon my bed and gazed out of the window, watching the birds dart hither and thither in a clear blue sky, thoughts of the time when I should be free as they arose in my mind, but failed to cheer my desponding heart. Through the silent hours of night I have watched, from my bed of pain, the myriad stars shining in the midnight sky, glancing glory from far-off worlds, but I sought in vain among that radiant silent throng for mine, and I would think of the day when, diseased and a cripple, I should be cast out into the world alone, with the brand of a convict, like the mark of Cain, upon my brow, without friends, without sympathy, without hope, useless, purposeless, to eat the bread of charity and die a beggar in the streets, with only these cold bright eyes above to witness at the last. Can it be wondered at, if under the influence of these feelings I began to repine against that Providence which had so whole life had been spent in constant warfare against society, and who had no other intention on regaining their liberty than to continue the struggle to the bitter end? The murderer, cheerful and complacent over the verdict of manslaughter, the professional garrotter in whose estimation human life is of no value, troubled only at being so foolish as to be caught, the polished thief and the skilled housebreaker, every one of them sound in wind and limb, intent only on their schemes and dodges to extract the sting from their punishment, or in planning new and more heinous crimes, and all longing for the time when they and society could cry quits, and they be at liberty to pursue their career of villainy. With these, the vilest of the vile, and also with the hoary criminal who knew no home save the prison, who preferred it to the poorhouse, and to whom its comforts were luxuries and its privations but trifles of no account, I was condemned to mingle. Repentant for what I had done in the past, capable and resolved to make amends in the future, having already suffered for my crime loss of friends, character, everything almost that is dear to man, I was condemned to lose my health, my limb, to be deprived of my only means of future subsistence, and to endure more years of degradation and suffering in prison than many of my wretched companions who had committed heinous crimes, and to whom penal servitude was no punishment. Such were some of the bitter reflections upon our criminal laws and prison regulations, in which, under the pressure of severe mental and bodily suffering, I then indulged. Writing now in a calmer and less indignant mood, I still commend them, and my subsequent experiences, to the consideration of thoughtful men, and I will leave it with them to decide whether the system maintained in our model prisons, of putting all prisoners, whatever their character and antecedents, who have similar sentences, on a footing of perfect equality, and in constant association with each other, is fitted to serve the purpose of even human justice, and whether it is not more likely to promote than to prevent the growth of crime. I had now been about a month in the hospital when the order came for my removal to a regular government convict establishment in Surrey. I was in a very unfit state for such a journey. I could not walk a single yard, even with assistance. My knee was so swollen that no trouser would go over it, but yet the journey had to be made, and on my arrival in Surrey I had to be carried by 2 prisoners to the hospital. End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. Surrey Prison, Daily Routine of Hospital Life, Set a Thief to Catch a Thief, My Leg Gets Worse, Amputation, Life Despaired of, Prison Doctors, Want of Periodical Hospital Inspection. The Surrey prison in which I was doomed to spend nearly 5 years of my life is a somewhat spacious looking building, situated in a healthy locality, and fitted up for the accommodation of about 660 prisoners. It is built in the shape of the letter E. The centre abutments are occupied as a chapel and workroom. The end wings are divided into cells, with an underground flat fitted up as a school and a Roman Catholic chapel. The upper story of the main portion of the building is divided into cells, which are the best specimens of the human cage yet constructed. The under flat is divided into 18 rooms of various dimensions, some containing 7, others 8 and 12, and the largest 24 beds. The middle flat is in constant use as an hospital, and is divided into 4 wards, containing accommodation for 150 patients. Very frequently, however, while I was there, that number was exceeded, and other portions of the prison were often appropriated to hospital use. As I was for upwards of 2 years after my arrival an inmate of one of these hospital wards, I may here give an account of the routine of our daily life there. At 5:30 every morning the great bell rang, and the nurses and convalescent patients started out of bed, washed and dressed, made their beds, rubbed their metal chamber service as bright as silver, a remarkable contrast in that respect to the metal dinner dishes, dusted and cleaned the ward, which was usually kept remarkably tidy and clean. About 6:30 breakfast was on the table. This meal consisted of very weak tea and dry bread for the majority, with an egg or half an ounce of butter for the few who were supposed to be dangerously ill or dying. In the interval between the breakfast time and 9 o'clock the patients' wounds were dressed by the nurses, and medicines served out by the officers of the ward, those patients not immediately under treatment having liberty to read or chat with each other. Before I left, however, the attempt was being made to prohibit this reading and talking, and to combine more punishment with the cure of disease. The 2 medical officers generally began their rounds of examination about 9 o'clock. As they entered the room, "Attention" was called, when all the prisoners out of bed stood up, and as the doctors passed, noting down on a ticket the date and remarks of each man's complaint, they were saluted by the patients in the military fashion. The doctor's visit over, the patients were assembled for prayers, after which, and until the dinner hour, 11:45, the time was spent in outdoor exercise. From 12 till 2 the patients sat on their stools, reading or gossiping. At 2 they went out again to exercise. At 3:30 they were again assembled for prayers. At about 5 they got tea and dry bread, as at breakfast, and at 8 o'clock they were all in bed. The dinner of the patients varied according to the nature of their disease. The majority was served with the regular hospital dinner, which consisted of soup, potatoes, and what the dietary boards called 10 ounces of mutton. With respect to the latter item, however, I fancied there must have been some mistake, although I have heard the prisoners characterize it in different and much stronger terms. Whether there be any mistake or not, 5 ounces, or it might occasionally be 6 ounces with the bone, is all the prisoners received, and if complaint was made the invariable answer was that it "lost 4 ounces in the cooking." I am not sufficiently skilled in the culinary art to be able to say whether or not 10 ounces of mutton loses 4 ounces in cooking, but the great majority of prisoners did not believe it, and the evil effects of placing 10 ounces on a board for the public to see, and 5 or 6 ounces in the dish for the prisoner to eat, are very great. The old maxim, "set a thief to catch a thief," was based on a shrewd acquaintance with human nature, and convicts are usually very quick in discovering discrepancies of the kind to which I have alluded, and it is not to be wondered at if they put the very worst construction upon them. In any case, if it forms any part of our prison discipline to inculcate moral principles, or to instil into the convict mind a regard for truth and honesty, it is surely of the utmost importance, indeed absolute necessary, that the prison authorities, their only instructors, should be beyond suspicion. As entertaining books and newspapers are not allowed him, the convict has nothing else to talk about but the conduct of his jailers, and foolish prison gossip, and any subject of the kind I have mentioned is eagerly discussed with very injurious results to all concerned. To return to my own case. After being carried upstairs to the hospital, I was inspected by the medical officer, and ordered into one of the largest wards, containing 36 beds, on one of which I was destined to pass many long and painful months. On the following morning my knee was examined by both the prison surgeons. Unfortunately they seemed to differ in opinion as to the treatment it should receive. The senior officer, who took charge of my case, wished to make a stiff joint, whilst his junior thought it should be lanced and poulticed to take out the matter, which by this time was creating an abscess in the joint. Had I been allowed to express my opinion on the subject, I would have supported the latter mode of treatment, but a convict dare not utter a word with respect to medical treatment. I was accordingly obliged to lie in one position for 3 months, with my leg strapped to a long slab, and to use a lotion which proved very injurious to it. During these 3 months I suffered the most intense pain. I not only could not get out of bed, but I could not change my position in it, and to add to the wretchedness of my situation, I could not read, and finally I could not even sleep. My food, however, was better and more abundant than it had been hitherto. At first I was allowed a little porter and some very inferior beef tea, in addition to the ordinary second-class hospital diet. Some time after, when my knee was being frequently leeched, I said to the doctor that, if he thought it necessary to take more blood from me, I would feel very grateful for a mutton chop in lieu of the beef tea. This he at the time very snappishly refused, but next morning he appeared to have seen the reasonableness of my request, and allowed me the chop. Being always truly grateful when I obtained any concession of this kind, and always civil and polite to those with whom I was brought into contact, whether officers or prisoners, I received more favourable consideration than the generality of my neighbours, and I had nothing to complain of, so far as regarded my diet, during my subsequent stay in the hospital. After a few weeks of great suffering to me, it became quite evident that my leg was not to get better under the treatment prescribed for it, but it was rapidly getting worse. The knee was now so sensitive that the tread of any person's foot passing near the bed caused me excessive pain. I was afraid to sneeze for the same reason, and at last so excruciating did the pain become that I begged and prayed to have my leg cut off. The idea of losing it, so horrible to me a few months previous, was altogether overpowered by the frightful torture which night and day it now entailed upon me. I was again inspected about this time by a stranger doctor, and immediately after he left, my leg was lanced and poulticed. But the remedy came too late, for the time had come when I must either sacrifice my life or give life a chance by the sacrifice of my leg. My readers can imagine for themselves what it must be to have the flesh cut and the bone sawn through at the thickest part of the thigh. I fear I cannot give a more lucid description of the surgical operation. I was put under the influence of chloroform, which had to be administered a second time before the surgeons had completed their work, and with the exception of a momentary pang in the interval between the doses, I felt no pain whatever. The operation was skilfully performed, and occupied altogether about half an hour. I was removed from the large ward and placed in a small room by myself, with a prisoner to wait upon me, and for 3 or 4 days after the operation my life was despaired of by the medical officers. Strangely enough I did not feel so hopeless about my case. I felt a whispering within that seemed to tell me I should not die then. With the exception of the pain caused by the first few dressings of the wound, a sharp and violent twinge that seized the stump on my going to sleep, causing it to start some inches from the pillow on which it rested, I did not now experience anything to compare with my previous sufferings. The head surgeon also relaxed from his customary silent, stingy and cold-hearted manner, and became generous and even kind to me. I had been in the habit of writing to my friends that I felt comfortable enough under the circumstances in order to keep up their spirits about me, but now I could and did express genuine feelings of gratitude, and until I wrote a letter to the late Mr. Cobden more than a year afterwards, I believe I remained a favourite with the chiefs of the establishment. I had now become a cripple for life, and as I reflected upon all that these words involved in relation to my future history, and the circumstances which had entailed upon me a loss so irretrievable, I thought, amongst other things, how easily, and still how fatally, a little carelessness, negligence, or ill temper on the part of our convict surgeons may influence the future life and conduct of their convict patients. They are without doubt subjected to many vexations and much annoyance, and their temper receives daily provocations. They have to deal professionally with a class of men who, as a rule, cannot be believed or trusted, who are as likely as not to give a false description of their complaint, and in many instances to do all in their power to frustrate the efforts made to relieve it. They have to discover not only what the disease is in real patients, but also frequently to detect well planned and well sustained imposture in those who are not diseased at all. The latter is a much more difficult task in many cases than the former, as I will subsequently show, and it has a tendency to sour the temper and harden the heart, which the former does not. I do not imagine that the medical men in our convict establishments are naturally less warm-hearted, less nobly devoted to their profession than their brethren outside, but it will not be disputed that the peculiar nature of their practice has a tendency to make them so. Were 100 doctors each to have a patient for whom they had daily, for weeks, and even for months, been doing all that humanity and professional skill could suggest in order to relieve him, let us suppose of great suffering and one fine morning to see the patient leap out of bed, laugh, and snap his fingers in their faces, and tell them that there had been nothing the matter with him all the while. 99 of them would probably look upon the next patient with some suspicion, and if deception was at all frequent, the really diseased would come in time to suffer even at the hands of the most tender and humane amongst them. I blame these schemers and impostors, therefore, for much of the apparent sourness, indifference to, and sometimes cruel neglect, if not positive aggravation of suffering, which I have noticed in the manner and treatment of most of the convict surgeons I have met with. I have seen the imperative necessity that exists for periodical inspection of our convict hospitals by competent medical men, not otherwise connected with them, in order to protect the innocent patients, if I may use the term, from the indifference, mismanagement, and even punishment they are often compelled to undergo, because of the prejudices contracted by the prison officials, the result of a long experience perhaps of imposture and deception. Under the present system the resident medical superintendent has the lives of his patients at his sole disposal, and it is a very dangerous thing for a convict patient to offend the medical officers in any way, and of course the more so if they happen to be of a cruel or vindictive disposition. My own case was in some respects an instance of this. The experience I gained in a Yorkshire prison, after I had ventured to insinuate to the doctor there that he had not quite understood the nature of my complaint, kept my mouth hermetically closed during the ill-conceived disagreement between the two doctors here as to the method of my cure. The chief medical officer at this prison was very much disliked by the majority of the patients, particularly by the young prisoners in the early stages of consumption. The cause of this was supposed to be the desire to keep the hospital well filled with patients, and to have the greater proportion of them of the class who were content to be idle without craving for extras. He could thus keep the cost per head lower than the medical officers at other prisons, and obtain the greater credit at head-quarters. Young consumptive patients he found to be too expensive, and they were accordingly made uncomfortable. His junior, on the other hand, although blunt in his manner and speech, was held in general esteem. He seemed to have his heart in the profession, and endeavoured to cure complaints deemed curable without reference to the expense of the diet, if it contributed to the end he had in view. In another chapter I shall again allude to this subject, and give a number of cases which came within the range of my own observation, to prove the justice of some of the reflections I have made on the want of periodical inspection of our prison hospitals. In the meantime my stump continued to discharge matter. An abscess formed and retarded the healing of the wounds, and it was not till I discovered a cure myself that it showed any symptoms of healing. The cure was to hold the stump under a tap of cold water, using friction afterwards. This I continued to do long after the wound had finally closed. Chapter 6. Of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. I petitioned the Home Secretary. Doctor pronounces me quite well. Schemers, their treatment and fate. Deathbed scenes. About 2 months after the amputation of my leg, feeling and believing that my health would never be restored in confinement, I wrote a petition to the Home Secretary, in the expectation that I would be as mercifully considered as my predecessors in misfortune. While my petition was under consideration, I was encouraged in my expectations by the fact that one of my companions, who had nothing the matter with him but a dislocated hip joint, was liberated on medical grounds 3 or 4 years before his time was up. My hopes were somewhat dampened, however, by another circumstance which just then occurred. The prison director arrived on his monthly visit, and on passing through the ward, the medical officer who accompanied him stopped at the foot of my bed and informed him that I was the man whose leg he had amputated, and that I was quite well now. The director, seeing me in bed and looking very poorly, and noticing the general stare with which the doctor's remark was received, asked in a somewhat doubtful way, "Is he quite well?" "Oh yes, quite well," the doctor replied, and off they went. I was 16 months in hospital after the above remark was made, and I was then unable to get up to have my bed made, nor did I leave my bed during the whole winter and spring that succeeded. I received an answer to my petition, shortly after the visit to which I have referred, in the usual form of an official negative, "Not sufficient grounds." Being now free from acute pain, I conversed freely with my companions, and taught some of them to spell, read, and cipher. After I was able to get out of bed, I read aloud for an hour every evening, for the benefit of all the patients. In time I became popular, and intimate with many of them. I wrote letters and petitions for them, encouraged them with good advice, and succeeded in obtaining considerable influence over them. In return for these trifling services, which also to some extent relieved the monotony of the long period I spent in hospital, they told me their history and experiences. I learnt their slang and thiefology, and as a theorist became tolerably conversant with all the mysteries by which the professional thief and scoundrel preys upon society. The first of my companions who attracted my attention was a young Scotchman. He appeared to be a very strong, hearty fellow, but when he attempted to walk he was the most pitiable looking cripple imaginable, and excited the sympathy of all who saw him. His sentence was 21 years, 4 of which he had undergone at this time. He had been invalided home from the convict establishment at Bermuda, was shipwrecked off the Isle of Wight on the return voyage, and had been some months in the hospital previous to my arrival. He was in the habit of being carried up and down stairs to exercise on the backs of the nurses, and was getting full diet and porter. About 4 months after my arrival, he one morning suddenly started out of bed, shouted "Attention" at the top of his voice in defiance of the prison rules, and ran about the room like a lamplighter, to the utter amazement of all present. This man was what the prisoners term a schemer, and he was certainly the very best actor of his class I ever met with. It will be acknowledged that he played his part well, when even during the shipwreck he had never made the slightest attempt to move, and kept up the deception for many months in a prison hospital, where the majority of the patients are put down as schemers, unless they have an outward sore, or some natural malady with palpable external symptoms. When the doctor came his rounds he could do nothing but stare at the fellow, who started up and told him with a laughing countenance that he had had a dream in the night about being miraculously cured, and in the morning he found he could walk as well as ever he did. The doctor never opened his lips. The patient was discharged, and although the other patients cried aloud that he ought to be punished, no further notice was taken of the matter. This schemer, I learned, had been a great sufferer from pleurisy at Bermuda, and was very weak when he was put on board ship, where he commenced his scheme, and had it not been for new regulations which were then put in force, there is no doubt he would have accomplished his object, which was liberation on medical grounds. He had petitioned the Home Secretary shortly before he threw his crutches aside, declaring that he had met with an accident at Bermuda from a stone falling on his back, and so injuring the spine that both his legs were paralysed. He had received a reply to the effect that his petition would be answered so soon as the authorities heard from Bermuda the particulars of the accident, and it was a few days after this that the miraculous visitation took place. I asked him why he did not wait for the final answer to his petition before exposing his seam. "Oh," he replied, "I knew very well if they wrote to Bermuda I should get no time off. I met with no accident, although I said so in my petition." "You will be very fortunate," I said. "If you get the customary remission after this affair, I feel they will punish you." "Look here," said he, "I have another scheme in my head, and you will see I'll not fail this time. I'll get out to Australia, and by the time I arrive I will be due for my liberty." "Well, that will certainly be better for you than being kept 8 or 9 years longer in prison here. But how are you to manage to get abroad unless the authorities choose to send you?" "Oh, I will work that. I'll now be as bad in my conduct as possible, and I'll half murder some of the officers if they don't send me away, and that very soon too." True to his threat, the fellow commenced a course of bad conduct, knowing it would ensure his passage to Western Australia, and in a comparatively short time he gained his object, and I have no doubt he is now at liberty abroad. About the time the above conversation took place, another schemer arrived, and was located a few beds from me. He had been a clerk in a government office, was respectably connected, and a very intelligent young man. He pretended he could not use his legs. The doctor's eye being now somewhat opened, he told him there was nothing the matter with him, recommended him to get well again as fast as possible, and threatened him with the electric battery and even hot irons if that did not succeed. The prisoner did not take advice, however, and the battery was tried upon him. After being stripped several times and made to cry out with pain, to the great amusement of his fellow prisoners, he ultimately took to crutches, first 2, then 1, with a stick, then the stick only, then nothing at all. He was afterwards removed to another prison. I saw several other cases similar to the one I have just mentioned, of pretended loss of the use of the legs, or partially inability to walk, but as there were no marked difference in the cases, I need not notice them. There was, however, an amusing incident connected with one of them which I may mention. This prisoner was allowed a little porter every day, which was served out about 1 o'clock. One day at that hour he happened to be in an adjoining room with his crutches, he could walk a little, when another prisoner cried out, "Porter, porter, quick, quick!" On hearing this cry, and afraid of losing his liquor, he bolted out, ran down the room, and had swallowed his porter before he had discovered that he had left his crutches behind him. Such cases as these injured the really sick, particularly those whose symptoms are not very apparent. Many prisoners adopt these schemes in order to get into hospital, where they get better food, less work, and have the chance of being with a favourite pal. Others will make themselves ill by swallowing tobacco, soap pills, or anything they know will make them sick. There are others again who are afraid to enter the hospital, lest they should be poisoned with a sleeping draught or some other medicine carelessly administered, and when they hear of any sudden death in hospital, they are ready to swear his light has been put out by the doctor. On the other hand, I have known it to happen that a prisoner went and complained to the doctor, who roughly told him he was a schemer, and the following week the prisoner was dead. Another time a healthy-looking old man with chest disease complained to the doctor of pain in that region. He was dosed repeatedly with salts and senna, the medicine for schemers, and in less than a fortnight he was buried. I could mention many cases similar to the above, and also others where the prisoner was his own murderer, if I may use the expression, but I will merely mention one of them. The patient in this case was afflicted with dropsy and some affection of the heart. He had been receiving 2 ounces of gin for a short time, which he fancied was doing him good, and being partial to that variety of medicine, he was annoyed when it was ordered to be discontinued. Accordingly he resolved to make himself ill again in order to get the allowance of gin, and swallowed a large piece of tobacco, which brought an increase to his heart complaint, and notwithstanding that the greatest attention was paid to his case by the doctor, before morning he was dead. The prisoner lay in the next bed to mine, and among the many death-bed scenes I witnessed while in prison, I never saw one where the fear of death was so apparent, or the state of mind so appalling to the beholder. The man had been a bully and an avowed infidel. The prospect of death had now come upon him with awful suddenness. Fear and trembling took hold upon him, and as he thought of his past life and the possible judgment seat before which he might the next moment be summoned to appear, remorse and doubt seemed to torture him more than physical pain. At the closing scene he was evidently trying to believe, but could not, for he kept repeating, "If there be a God, if there be a God, I hope he will forgive me, but I can't believe it, indeed I can't," and so saying he expired. Another death-bed scene impressed me much. The patient was paralysed in his lower extremities and could scarcely walk, but his general health appeared pretty good, and he was not confined to bed. He had a talent for mechanics and arithmetic, but a very bad temper and a very bad heart. His crime was sacrilege. In the next bed to his there lay a patient who was dying, and being in great pain was making a noise, which disturbed the studies and peace of mind of the other. A quarrel arose between the two on the subject. High words ensued. Curses, deep, black, loud and long, soon followed, too soon for the officer to prevent, and there would certainly have been a fight if the dying man could have got out of bed, but the interference of the officer put an end to the disturbance. It was their parting words taken in connection with what followed that made a deep impression upon me. "If it wasn't that you are dying, I would blacken your eyes for you," cried the mechanic. "How do you know I am dying? You look as like dying as anybody, you miserable cripple," retorted the other. "Ah, I'm tough enough. You'll not see me die in a hurry." The cripple who uttered these words went shortly afterwards to bed, and was seized with a paralytic affection, which took the power of speech from him. He never uttered another syllable, but lay in bed for about a week, making frantic motions with his lips. I forget which of these 2 men died first, but they were buried together in the same grave. Another death at this time excited a good deal of conversation among the prisoners. The patient had been tried under the Transportation Act, one of the by-laws of which enacted that for every prison report or offence the prisoner would lose 1 month of his remission. But convicts being usually punished under the most recent law, without reference to it being different from that under which they had received sentence, the prisoner I now refer to was sentenced to lose 3 months of his remission for one offence, that of having an inch or 2 of tobacco on his person. He had undergone nearly the whole of this additional punishment, when, only a few hours before his time came to leave the prison to meet his motherless children, for whom he seemed to have a very strong affection, he died suddenly of heart disease. Some prisoners expired on the very day for their liberation. Some died screaming aloud that they were poisoned. Many died like the brutes, and a very few departed in peace, with a prayer on their lips. The great majority died as they had lived, and were forgotten by the spectators almost before their bodies had been laid in the grave. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. Thiefology, what the uninitiated convict may learn in prison. As a means of beguiling the time while in the hospital, I used to enter into long conversations with those of my fellow prisoners who were willing to gratify my curiosity, with a view of ascertaining their mode of life when out of prison. At first it was somewhat difficult for me to follow them in their talk, in consequence of their excessive use of slang terms, but in time I not only came to understand the nomenclature of thiefology, but also to use it fluently, as I found it more acceptable to my companions to do so, and rendered them more favourably disposed towards me. One of my fellow prisoners was particularly communicative and obliging, and gave me a great deal of well-meant advice, no doubt, as to how I might live at the public expense outside the prison walls, as well as explanations in every department of crime. I remember the following dialogue taking place between us, which also serves to show how an ignoramus in the service, or a young country lad, perhaps for the first time convicted of crime, might be instructed in vice, and incited to continue a career he had perhaps very thoughtlessly, or under strong temptation, began. "Harry," I asked, "what's that bloke (6) man here for, who occupies the end bed?" "Twining." "Twining, what's that? Don't you know that yet? Why, you must be a greenhorn not to know that. Well, I'll tell you. Suppose you start in the morning with a good sovereign and a snide (7) counterfeit, half sovereign in your pocket. You go into some place or other and ask for a change of the sovereign, or you order some beer and give the sovereign in payment. It's likely you will get half a sovereign and silver back in change. Then it's time to twine. You change your mind after you have rung (8) substituted your snide half quid sovereign with the good one, and throwing down the snide half. Say you prefer silver. The landlord or landlady, or whoever it is, will pick up the snide half quid, thinking of course it is the same one they had given you. Is that a good game, do you think? Well, that depends on the party. If he has got good togs on, looks pretty decent, and can work it well, he may make a good living at it. How much do you suppose? If he can manage to begin every morning with yellow stuff, he may make a couple of quid a day, but if he can only muster white stuff, why, of course he can't make so much. £2 a day would do if it could be got regularly, but I suspect there are not many who make that. Oh, I have known them make much more than that, but of course it varies. Some days nothing may be done, but the great thing is to have something to start with. Do you ever think of trying to make money at work?" "Work! No, by jingo, I'll never work. That's all they can make one do in prison, and it will be time enough to work when we get there." "I have heard you speak of hoisting. How do you go about that?" "Ah, that's a much better game, but it requires a fellow to be rigged out like a toff, and then generally have a flash mole, prostitute of the gayest sort, with them at that job. She can secrete articles about her dress when in a shop looking at things, and that's one way of hoisting. Jewellers' shops are the best places for that game. I know a bloke who made several hundreds at it. He took fine lodgings, and his mole looked quite the lady, so he orders some jewellery to be sent on sight. He prigs the best of it and bolts. Then you can get snide jewellery made to look the same as real stuff, and when you are in the shop with your mole, she is trying on a ring perhaps, when you put the snide one in its place, and she sticks to the right one." "I am afraid that game would be above my abilities." "Well, I'll tell you what I did once, and what you may do when you get out, when winter sets in. You can have some other game in summer, perhaps go hawking, and do a bit of thieving when you see the coast clear. My brother and I and another bloke went out chance screwing one winter, and we averaged £3 a night each. My brother had a spring cart with a fast trotting horse, so when it began to grow dark, off we set to the outskirts of London. I did the screwing in this way. Wherever I saw a lobby lighted with gas, I looked in at the keyhole. If I saw anything worth lifting, I screwed the door. I'll teach you how to do it. Seized the things into the cart with them, and off to the next place. Now, Big Davy goes out about the same time as you, and he knows a bloke with a cart, and so you may do very well at winter at that game, but be sure to leave off by 9 o'clock, as you would get it very hot if caught after that time." "Well, I shall see Big Davy perhaps, but don't you think high flying would suit me better, although I know little about it?" "Oh, that's above your mark. A high flyer is a bloke who dresses like a clergyman or some gentleman. He must be educated, for his game is to know all the nobility and gentry, and visit them with got up letters, and that kind of thing, for the purpose of getting subscriptions to some scheme. A church building or missionary affair is the best game. There is only one good high flyer in the prison. I knew him get 150L from a gentleman in Devonshire once, and he thinks nothing of getting 30L of a morning." Finding my friend so communicative and apparently so experienced in the various branches of his profession, I took advantage for every convenient opportunity to ascertain from him the meaning of the slang terms which my comrades made use of when conversing together, but through ignorance of which I was often unable to understand exactly what they were talking about. On another occasion I accordingly asked him the meaning of a number of these terms, which I had thus heard bandied about from time to time amongst them. On asking him about macing, he replied, "Macing means taking an office, getting goods sent to it, and then bolting with them, or getting goods sent to your lodgings and then removing. I'll tell you a game that you might try now and again as you have a chance, and that is fawney dropping. You know fawney means a ring. Well, you must have a pal and give him a snide ring with a ticket and the price marked on it. When you are walking along the street and see a likely toff to buy the ring, your pal goes on before and drops it. You come up behind him, and in front of the gentleman you pick up the ring, which is ticketed, say £5. Well, you turn to the toff and say to him that you have found a ring which is entirely useless to you, as you never wear these articles, and ask him to purchase it. He will most likely look at the ticket and see it marked £5, and if you say you will let him have it for £3 or £2, or even for £1 if he hesitates, it is also likely he will buy it. thinking he is getting a great bargain. "What do you mean by snow dropping?" I asked. "Ah," said he, "that's a poor game. It means lifting clothes off the bleaching line, or hedges. Needy mizzlers, mumpers, shallow blokes, and flats may carry it on, but it's too low and paltry for you." "What do you mean by mumpers and shallow blokes?" I inquired. "Why, mumpers are cadgers, beggars in fact. There's old Dick over in that bed there, he used to go mumping, and when he got boozy with too much lush he stole some paltry thing or other, and being so often convicted they have legged him at last. They can't make an honest living, and can't make a living by thieving. But you know it's different with you. You could make a fair thing by snotter hauling, even if you cannot get on at fly buzzing, which would suit you well enough. But it's better to stick to one good game and get as expert at that as you can, for then you don't run so much risk, and you can keep a sharper look out after the coppers. Policemen. Talking of mumping, old Dick used to go to the farmhouses with a piece of dried cow dung, and ask for a bit of butter to put on it. Very often they took pity on him and gave him lots of meat, for they thought he must be very hungry to eat the cow dung, which of course, you know, was only a dodge, in order to get to Liverpool once from some place up the Mersey, whence the fare down was a shilling. Dick went on board the steamer and asked the captain what he charged for lambs. "A penny head," says the captain. "Oh, that would do," says Dick, and away he goes among the passengers. When they were collecting the fares, Dick holds out his penny, which was all the tin he had in the world. "The fare's a shilling," said the captain. "Yes, it may be," said Dick, "but I asked you the fare for lambs. My name is Lamb. I am an innocent creature, and the long and short of it is, I've only a penny. If you can't take it, just give me a sail back again. That chap over there with the one arm is a regular mumper, and he is a strong robust fellow, able to work with every man in the prison, but he can make 10 times more by mumping, and I do not blame the like of him going on that racket. Every man for himself in this world. Do you see that little old man with a cough on him? Well, his game is needy mizzling. He'll go out without a shirt perhaps, and beg one from house to house. I have known him to get 30 meal togs shirts in one day, which at a bob apiece would fetch their 30 shillings. When he can't go on that racket, he'll turn mumper and wood merchant, which means a seller of lucifer matches, and sometimes he will take to rag and bone collecting." "What do you call a shallow bloke?" "He is a cove that acts the turnpike sailor, pretends he has been shipwrecked and so on, or he gets his arm bandaged and put in a sling. I once knew 2 blokes who went to an old captain's house on that game, and as they were not able to reply to some of his nautical questions, he and his son gave them a regular horsewhipping. When they got home they boasted to a lot of their chums how much they had screwed out of the old captain. This induced some of them to go on the same racket, and of course they met with the same warm reception. These shallow blokes turn duffers sometimes. They get some duffing silk handkerchiefs and cigars, and go about selling them for smuggled goods, or perhaps they will take to singing in the streets, but I spoke of snotter hauling. Although I think you are too old for that racket, and unless you were very hard up and in a crowd, I would not bother about it. It would not pay for the risk run. It does best for kids. Boys. A little boy can sneak behind a toff and relieve him of his wipe as easily as possible, I know a little fellow who used to make 7 bob a day at it on the average, but there were more silk wipes used then than there are now." "What do you mean by lob sneaking and Peter screwing?" "Why, lob means the till, and Peter means a safe. Stealing the till and opening the safe is what we call lob sneaking and Peter screwing." "And what is jumping and jilting?" "Jumping is getting into a house through the window, and jilting is getting in on the sly or on false pretences at the door, and sneaking what you can find. It is not a bad game to go into hotels, for instance, as a traveller, and as soon as you see a chance to sneak anything, to bolt with it. I know some fellows who make a fair living in this way." "Then there is twisting and fencing?" "When you go into any place where hats, coats, or umbrellas are left in the lobby, you can take a new tog or a new hat by mistake for your own. That is twisting, or rigging the chances. Then the fence master is the fellow who buys stolen property. I will give you the names of some of these blokes in London before you go out, but you must know where to dispose of a supper, watch, or whatever you get, or it would be of no use to you. You know what buzzing or pocket picking is, of course, and you have heard of working on the stop, most likely, which means picking pockets when the party is standing still, but it is more difficult on the fly. You must remember that. I remember once going along Oxford Street, and I pricked an old woman's poke purse on the fly. She missed it very quick, and was coming after me when I slipped it into an old countryman's pocket as I was passing. She came up and accused me with stealing her purse. I, of course, allowed her to search me, and asked her to fetch a bobby if she was not satisfied. Well, I followed the old countryman and accused him of stealing my purse, and my crikey, if you had only seen how the old codger looked when he found the purse in his pocket. I threatened to give him in charge of the first copper I saw, and he was so frightened that I actually got a quid out of him to let him off." "Well, now tell me about snide pitching." "Snide, you know, means counterfeit or bad. Anything bad we call snide. Snide pitching is passing bad money, and is a capital racket, especially if you can get rid of fins." "What are fins?" £5 notes or flash notes. I can give you the address of 1 or 2 fellows who make bad coins, and you can pass 1 or 2 when you see a fair chance." "What do they charge for sovereigns, for instance?" "The charge depends on the quality. You can get them at from 6 to 15 shillings. Those at 15 shillings no one can discover. They are the weight, the size, and all that is required. The low priced ones, of course, you must run more risk with. Making bad coins is one of the best games out, and you can carry it on with less risk. For instance, you can have your place where you work so blocked up that before anyone can enter you will have time to destroy all your dies and tools and melt or plant your metal, and without them they cannot convict you. I know a bloke in Birmingham now who was getting up Scotch £1 notes when I was copped, and he is a capital hand at the trade. He once made a good deal by making snide postage stamps." "But one would require to know something about the different metals before they could be able to make snide." "Yes, that is necessary, but I think I know who will tell you. He has got 20 years, and is not likely to get a chance of doing more at the trade. These fellows who follow that racket are rather close, and don't want to tell everyone. The other day I heard a bloke talking about a picking up mole he used to live with." "What did he mean by that?" "Oh, that's a very common racket. He meant a flash tail, or prostitute, who goes about the streets at night trying to pick up toffs. When she manages to do this, her accomplice, the coshman, a man who carries a cosh or life preserver, comes up, when she has signed to him that she has got the toff's watch and chain, and quarrels with him for meddling with his wife. Whilst the quarrel is going on, the mole walks off with the booty. I know one coshman who pretends to be a missionary and wears a white choker. Instead of quarrelling, he talks seriously to the toff about the sin of fornication, and advises him to pursue a more becoming life in future, and finishes off by giving him a religious tract. Now I have nearly finished my questions, but whilst there is time, tell me about magging and mag flying. Magging is not so good a game as it used to be. It means more particularly swindling a greenhorn out of his cash by the mere gift of the gab. You know, if it were not for the flats, how could the sharps live? You can mag a man at any time you are playing cards or at billiards, and in various other ways. As for mag flying, that is not good for much. You have seen those blokes at fairs and races throwing up coppers or playing at pitch and toss. Well, these are mag flyers. The way they do it is to have a penny with 2 heads or 2 tails on it, which they call a grey, and of course they can easily dupe flats from the country. How do they call it a grey, I wonder? I suppose they have named it after Sir George Grey, because he is a 2-faced bloke. Well then, tell me about locussing and bellowsing. Locussing is putting a chap to sleep with chloroform, and bellowsing is putting his lights out, in other words, drugging and murder. Now then, show me how to hang a fellow up, or put the flimp on him, as you call it. I see that bone in the wrist, just get that on the windpipe, so, showing me practically how to garrote. While at this interesting experiment, we heard a voice cry, cheese it, Harry, there's the screw looking at you," which warned us that the prison warder was also taking notes, and my lesson for that day came to a rather abrupt conclusion. Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Another Companion, A Career of Crime, His Opinions about Religion and Church Rates, An Incurable, His Opinion about Flogging. Another of my companions in hospital gave me the particulars of his history in answer to my inquiries. I gave them precisely in his own words. "I was about 15 years of age before I stole any money, or got into any trouble, but I used to nick little things, such as fruit, etc., when I was a kid. My father kept a small shop, but I was bound an apprentice to a very peculiar branch of the Sheffield trade, and before I had finished my apprenticeship I committed my first crime. I was playing at bagatelle one night, and lost all my cash, and as I was anxious to win it back, I broke into my master's premises, and took all of the money that was in the cash box. I got copped, and was sent into the country jail. When I came out, I enlisted in the army. My father bought me off after I had been in the regiment a short time. I then took to hawking, but I did not make much money at that, so I enlisted again, deserted, and got flogged, and the flogging made me a blackguard, committed another crime, and got out of the army. Afterwards I committed other crimes, and was at last copped and sentenced to 5 years' penal servitude. I was sent to do most of it in Gibraltar. After coming home I resolved I should make a fair trial to gain an honest livelihood. I had about £13 of the gratuity coming to me, and by the aid of the vicar I got all that at once, and set up as a greengrocer. But as I was not very well acquainted with the business, I soon lost my little capital, and I resolved to try and get work at my trade. I called on all the gaffers in that business, but none of them would employ me. Those who knew me would have nothing to do with me. Those who didn't wanted a character, which of course I could not give. Well, I went 2 days without tasting a bit of food, but on the third I ate some turnips. On the fourth day I became so desperate with hunger that I determined on going on the cross. I commenced and committed 17 burglaries right off in various parts of the country. The first was in my own town, and the moment I got the wedge (18) silver plate planted (19) hidden (19), I went to the police office and asked for a bed for the night, as I had no money. Next day early there was a great hubbub about my job. One of the police came to the office and swore it must have been done by me, but when the superintendent told him that I had slept in the station house all night, and that it could not have been me, he never said any more about it. The next place I robbed was a church, but all the rest were shops. I was tried for the church and 2 of the other jobs, but I got off the former, and as the clergyman prosecuted me, when it ought to have been some other official connected with it, I pleaded guilty to the second charge against me, and it's that I'm now here for. When I was in prison waiting for trial, I called myself a Roman Catholic, and was visited by the priest. One day I confessed to him that I had robbed a church, and that I was very sorry for it, and so I was, upon my word. That's the only crime I ever committed which gave me any trouble. Well, the priest was thunderstruck, and looked daggers at me, but when I told him it was a Protestant church, he gave me absolution, and said the crime was not so bad as he at first thought. "What religion do you profess now?" I inquired. "Well, I'm down in the books now as a Protestant, or Church of England man, but I do not believe all that churchmen believe. I think there's a good deal of humbug about what is called Christianity altogether. I have tried several creeds, and there's none of them squares exactly with my ideas." "Which of them have you tried?" "I was 18 months a Mormon. My uncle is an elder in their church, but I got enough of them one night at a meeting. After the business was concluded, one of the members proposed that the lights should be put out during the remainder of the proceedings. My crikey, that night was enough for me. I was in earnest at first though, and when I was baptized and anointed, I intended to have gone out to the settlement in America." "What do you object to in the Church of England?" "Oh, I don't pay much attention to these matters. I like a good man, no matter what church he belongs to. For instance, the Presbyterian minister at Gibb was a first-rate man, and so is that chaplain at Pentonville, the Reverend Mr. Sherman, but I am of the barber's opinion about church rates." "What was his opinion?" "Well, a certain barber opened a shop down our way, and shortly afterwards was called on to pay the church rates. 'Church rates,' says he, 'what have I to do with church rates? I never go near the church. I belong to the dissenters.' 'Well, but you know the church is always open to receive you, and every Sunday the doors are open for you to come and worship, and you ought to consider it a privilege to be permitted to attend on the ministration of God's holy word,' was the reply. 'I do not consider it a privilege to go to a church I don't believe in,' said the barber. 'I go to a different church which I am pleased with, and therefore I won't pay you any rates.' 'But you know the law will compel you to pay them.' 'Oh then, there they are. If the law says so, it must be done.' 'Well, as you have paid me so promptly, I shall be a regular customer of yours, and will now have a shave, and my hair cut,' said the collector. He was only continued for a short time, however, to patronise the barber, having found a shop nearer home and more convenient. But at the end of the year the barber made out his account all the same as if he had continued his custom as he had promised to do. When the collector got the account he said, "How's this? I don't owe you a quarter of this sum. You must have made a mistake. I have only been so many times at your shop altogether, and yet you charge me as if I had gone all the year round." "My dear sir," replied the barber, "you know that my shop, as by law established, is always open to receive you, excepting Sunday, when your shop is open, so that you may avail yourself of my skill, and you ought to consider it a very great privilege to be permitted to do so." "I don't consider it any privilege to get that from you which I can get from others that I happen to prefer, on the same terms, and therefore I refuse to pay your account." "Then it appears I am obliged to pay your account whatever it may be, whether I get value for it or not, but yet you are not obliged to pay me mine unless you do get value for it, even when you promise to take value. Good morning." "Good morning," said the collector, and the barber retired. You will see from this colloquy what the barber's notions were about church rates. Now I have an idea that it is most unjust for one set of religious men to force their neighbours who differ from them to help to pay for the support of their church, particularly when they are able themselves to do all that is required in any way, if they were willing. This mainstay and foundation being rotten, the fabric cannot be secure. The churchman acts unjustly in this, and to act unjustly is anti-Christian. Therefore the churchman is no Christian any more than I am a Dutchman. Well, we'll leave the church question at present. Have you anything more to tell me about yourself? Have you never thought seriously about changing your mode of life when you get out of prison again? An intelligent fellow like you would do well in America, and I would strongly recommend you to leave the country as soon as you get your liberty." "As to altering my conduct, I tell you that when I was in the separate cells I did resolve on it, and began to pray and read good books, but after I got among the other prisoners I gave it all up again. I should like to go abroad well enough, but I shall not have funds for it, so I must stop at home." "Then do you intend to go thieving and robbing again?" "Well, I shall never go another day without food, that's certain. If I can get it honestly, good and well. If not, I'll steal. Why should a man starve in a Christian country?" "You have the workhouse to go to." "The workhouse? It's a second jail. I would nearly as soon be in prison, and when you have a chance of getting off without being caught, it's better to run the risk and chance it, for all the difference there is or ever can be between the workhouse and the prison. They can't make a man work unless they feed and clothe him, any more than they can make a steam engine go without fuel. Well, give me food and I'll work. Work is no punishment to me, if I can get meat to support it, and if I don't, I can't. That's all about it. But what's the good of making me work for years, at work that will not be of any use to me when I get out? I have only learnt one trade. There are only a very few men in that trade. They won't employ me. Then what am I to do? Starve in a Christian country? It isn't likely. And as for the workhouse, I shall never go to it as long as I can be fed in prison, with the chance always of being kept out of both." "Suppose they should flog you next time?" "In the first place, I have a disease on me now that would prevent me from being flogged, so that I have no fear of flogging. But even if I was able to stand flogging, all the difference it would make to me would be to make me keep a sharper eye after the coppers. Small gain would not then tempt me so much. I should look after large stakes, to go in at heavier jobs, and calculate well my chances of escape before going to work. Once I had made up my mind to commit a crime, and saw the coast clear, the chances of all the floggings in the world would not deter me. I'll find you fellows in the prison to-day who will take a good round flogging for a pound of tobacco. Now do you think that the mere chance of the lash would hinder these men from attempting to get hold of a few £100 worth of jewellery? It's not likely. Thieves weren't frightened into honesty by the gallows, nor would they be now, if they were to be cut into mincemeat. Thousands might be led into honest ways if suitable work was found for them, but it would require to be very different work from that of the navvy, and then many of them have to be learned to work before they could make a living at all. Then you don't think flogging did you any good at all? Certainly it did not, and what's more, you will never find a man doing much good after being flogged. It either makes him an invalid or a desperado. It may make him quiet under authority, but it ensures the very opposite when he is free. This prisoner was a more than usually clever and intelligent type of a numerous class of convicts, not the most difficult class to cure, but the next to it, perhaps. Unlike the city-bred professional thief, he had been taught to work, and such work as he could perform was no punishment to him. Unlike the professional, he goes out of the prison hesitating, wavering as to his future course, willing to take work if suitable, determined to avoid the workhouse, easily tempted to steal, resolved to do so rather than starve, but on the whole anxious to make a comfortable livelihood. He had one son, and I remember well how glad he was when some benevolent person wrote to him to say that he had been bound an apprentice to a respectable trade. He is now dead. Another of my companions was of a somewhat different class, and a much more difficult subject to deal with. He told me that he was 57 years of age. I asked him how long he had been a prisoner, not adding his sentences together, but how long he had actually been in prison. 37 years, he replied. How old were you when you got into trouble first? 14. What was your sentence? 7 years transportation. How did you like Australia? Well, the place is well enough, and a man can get a living easier abroad than he can at home, but I have been rather a queer customer in my time. I don't believe there's a man in this prison, or in any prison, who has gone through more hardships and punishments than I have done. Were you ever flogged? Flogged? I should think I have. Just wait until night when I am going to bed, and I'll let you see my back all in ridges with the cat. What effect had the flogging on your conduct? Flogging takes out one devil and puts in 7. That's the effect it had on me, but there's not one in 100 could stand the floggings and punishments I have endured. I had 10 years once in Australia, and I was in the penal class most of the time, and by jingo, they know how to punish there. Suppose I were to offer you 20L to be flogged, would you accept the money and take the flogging? I should think I would, and that very quick too. I would as soon take a bashing as bread and water for 7 days. Then a bashing, as you call it, would not frighten you from committing a crime? If I thought I was going to be caught even, I should not commit a crime. A flat or a mumper may do a job to get into prison, but I never do anything unless I believe I am to escape. It's the getting caught that's the crime. The punishment you have got to chance. A fellow needn't begin thieving if he is to be frightened at punishment. He would never make a living at it. It requires a fellow with a good heart to be a thief, I can tell you, and if his heart is not in the right place, he'd better keep on the square. Now tell me, do you never think seriously about your evil ways? You are getting up in years, and although you appear to be very robust in your general health at present, you cannot expect to live very much longer in this world. Well, to tell you the truth, I do sometimes think of leading an honest life, but I am so hardened now to all punishment that I don't care very much what I do. It's not easy for a man at my age to change all of a sudden to be a Christian, and then it's so difficult to get work suitable for one's abilities that I am almost driven to go on the cross. I have a very good brother who has been very kind to me, and I've been thinking several times of going home and getting work from him. He is the only man who ever did me a kindness since I was 14 years of age, and I love and respect him very much." This man had been longer in prison than any other I met with. He had been 5 times a convict. I considered him the very worst of a certain class of prisoners that I ever knew, and felt quite convinced that he would not be many weeks out of prison. He was constantly trafficking with his fellow prisoners, and when he could get a chance to steal, his hands would be at work. I remember his being in a cook house for a time, and almost every day he stole several pounds of mutton or beef. He would steal anything for an inch of tobacco. He was turned out of the cook house on the suspicion that they never could punish him for the thief except on one occasion, which happened in the following manner. The prisoners were in the habit of getting a pint of oatmeal gruel for supper. This pint of gruel was supposed to contain 2 ounces of meat, but in order to make it part better it was made thinner, so that every night there was a surplus. This surplus the prisoners thought belonged to them, and some of the officers permitted the orderlies for the day, who served it out, to divide whatever remained amongst the prisoners in their own wards. The authorities, however, did not allow the prisoners more than a pint, no matter whether it was thick or thin, no matter whether there was only 1 ounce of meal in it. Back to the cook house and the swirl tub the surplus must go. Some officers adhered to the rule, others did not. The officer in charge of the prisoner referred to was one of those who did, and when my friend helped himself to a pint out of the surplus gruel, he was reported the same evening, which happened to be a Saturday. On Sunday the governor, departing from his usual custom, came to his cell and passed sentence on him there. When the prisoner came out of chokey, as the punishment cells are called by the prisoners, he came to me about the Sunday sentence of a hungry man for taking a pint of gruel, which in some proportion belonged to himself. He fancied it was not legal to pass sentence on a Sunday, and thought he might get back the time he had forfeited, by appealing to the director. I told him I did not approve of the conduct of the governor, but at the same time expressed the opinion that the director would not interfere in his case. Whether he did so or not I am unable to say, as I was removed before the director's visit was due. This prisoner was a big stout man, above 13 stone weight, and there was nothing the matter with him except a diseased leg. This leg was rather a convenience to him than otherwise. If he disliked any work he was put to, he could always get rid of it by making his leg sore, and this could not be prevented, nor brought directly home to him. When he was at Dartmoor prison he was always in hospital, but now, as his work pleased him better, he seldom troubled the doctor. On the contrary, when about due to go home, that is when he arrived at his last stage, and became entitled to beer and other privileges, he wanted to get out of the invalid prison, where these privileges are not allowed unless the state of the invalid requires them, and to be sent to the public works, where they would be granted. Many convicts are so afflicted that they can almost compel the doctor to admit them into the hospital. So whenever they are put into some billet they like they are well, and whenever they are put into one they dislike they send in a sick report, and the medical officer in general must admit them. This was the case with the prisoner I have referred to. Moreover, I question if he was ever a single day in the prison without doing something that was considered wrong, and yet he was very seldom detected or punished. Every day he was trafficking, frequently he was stealing, and he told lies as a rule. Speaking the truth was quite an exceptional matter with him. Thieves generally consider it to be a virtue rather than a sin to tell a lie to save a pal from punishment, but in cases where their own interests are not specially at stake, they can speak the truth as well as other men. But this prisoner seemed utterly incapable of speaking the truth, even when falsehood brought no advantage to him. Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Another Prisoner, Happy as King, Cure of a Doctor, the Tobacco and Food Exchange, Another Jailbird, Civil and Lazy, Undeserved Remission, Prison Directors, and how they discharge their duties. I petition to go abroad on insufficient grounds. Another prisoner I knew had been about 32 years in prison. He was paralysed, and if he had been allowed a little tobacco daily, would have been as happy as a king, and never sought to leave the prison. He generally sold most of his food to other prisoners for tobacco. Occasionally he was detected and punished, and I always observed that he came out of chokey fatter than when he went in. Neither was his an exceptional case in this respect. The penal diet, which mainly consists of farinaceous food, will keep up the flesh, though not the strength, as well as the regular diet. In Scotland I have seen prisoners get stout in appearance on the oatmeal, but on the other hand they generally broke out in boils, after being 6 or 9 months without other varieties of food. And I have also known very stout men lose 2 or 3 stone in weight in as many months. I am inclined to believe that tobacco is beneficial in cases of insufficient food. I do not use it myself, nor do I think it beneficial to those who have plenty of food, but the reverse. I have known prisoners, however, who had good health in the Scotch prisons when they used tobacco, and fortunately for them, the weed and many other luxuries are easily obtained there, if you only know the way and have money. If I had known the commencement of my prison career what I know now, I might have had mutton chops daily, if I had been inclined to adopt some of the dodges I afterwards learnt. I knew one prisoner who obtained his end in a somewhat questionable way. He had made some complaint to the doctor, who, as usual, paid very little attention to it. On seeing that he was not to receive any medical aid by fair means, he resorted to foul, and took up a certain utensil full to the brim, and emptied its contents in the face and over the shirt front of the hapless pill compounder. The remedy was doubtless severe, but the disease was chronic, and the improvement marked and rapid. The prisoner got good diet, and was soon after in good health. The price of tobacco at the Thieves' Palace, or Invalid Criminal Hotel, for so the Surrey prison was sometimes designated by the inmates, was about 1 shilling per ounce, when I left. It seldom went below 10d. At first, when I arrived, there were yards of it in one place or another, but the crime of having a bit of it found on the person being now severely punished, the convicts kept it out of sight more carefully, and are more on their guard, seldom having more on their person than they can swallow. All fly men who use tobacco can procure it in any convict prison, but the flats have to deny themselves the prisoner's greatest luxury, but even they sometimes get a taste of it by selling their food. An inch of tobacco will fetch 4 ounces of cheese, or mutton. It will also procure 1½ pounds of bread. Sometimes it is worth more, according to the business abilities of the trader. The exchange of food is a daily custom. One prisoner with a good appetite, requiring double the allowance of food, will give 4 ounces of cheese for 23 ounces of bread, or 5 ounces of mutton for the same quantity. In this way the man with the capacious stomach gets it filled, and the man with a dainty appetite gets better food. All this sort of traffic is quite contrary to the prison rules, and in the case of tobacco it is severely punished, but prisoners will have it, and many of them do have it regularly. The prisoner referred to at the commencement of this chapter was remarkable for his love of the weed, and it was not often he missed a day without getting a taste of it, at the sacrifice, however, of nearly all his food. He was only fit for the jail or the workhouse, and would commit a theft rather than deny himself a single meal. I will mention only another of my companions in hospital, whose case will illustrate with what wisdom and discrimination the prison directors and governors use the powers delegated to them, encouraging the well-behaved and reforming the penitent convict. This prisoner had been a long time a convict. I asked him when he was first convicted. "In 1838, he replied. "What sentence did you then receive?" "I got 2 sentences, one 7 years and the other 8 years, making 15 together, and I did about 7 years and 8 months out of the 15. "You got a free pardon, I suppose?" "Yes." "Did they not send you abroad then?" "My health was not very strong, and I did my time at the ships." "How did you like them?" "Oh, very well. There was not so much of this stupid humbugging us about system as there is now, but we were not kept so clean. The Scots Greys were frequently on the march on the clothes of the convicts." "What was your next sentence?" "Life." "How many years did you do?" "I got off on medical grounds when I had done about 2 years and a half. I got copped again, however, and was sent back to do life a second time. Then I was liberated after I had done 7½ years more, making 10 years altogether out of 2 lives." "What have you got this time?" 10 years. "What do you intend to do when you get out this time?" "Why, it is no use trying to get work. I am not able for anything very hard now, and I think I shall make snide half-crowns." "You'll get caught again if you commence that game." "No, I won't. I did that when I was out last, and several times before, and I have never been caught yet for that job. I can go and buy silver spoons and get tools that I can destroy in a few minutes." "But why not go to the workhouse?" "The workhouse! Why, the workhouse in our country is as bad, if not worse than this, and this is bad enough. No, I will never enter a workhouse as long as I can get anything to steal. Some workhouses are better than this, but then when you steal you are not always caught, and you have yourself to blame if you're copped. I will steal the very first chance I get, as soon as I get out the gates. They won't give me work I can make a living at, and I'll not starve nor want a single meal. I'll have better mutton the day I get out than we have here, perhaps, and it will cost me nothing." This prisoner was a thorough jail bird, quiet and civil to his officers, growling at his food, slow to work, but always doing a little, a very good example of the type civil and lazy. He received his 10 years' sentence about 4 years ago, when it was customary for those who had revoked a licence to be refused a remission of sentence a second time. But in September 1864 he was credited with 2½ years' remission, and in the summer of 1865 he was credited with another 3 months, unasked, unexpected, and in the latter case quite inexplicably consistently with justice to others. Indeed, the only explanation which can be given of this undeserved and unexpected leniency is to suppose that the prison officials, like shopkeepers, treat their regular customers best, and that they do not see any reason why their business should not be encouraged, and the prisons kept as full and quiet as possible by the same methods as other men adopt who have to make an honest living by their trade. We have seen the effects of cotton famine, and I am sure matters would have come to a sad pass if we were to witness a convict famine, and to be compelled to open our workhouse gates to the starving families of our convict guardians. It is very natural and in a sense laudable that these latter should seek by such means as are available to them to prevent the occurrence of any such calamity. Hence civil, quiet ruffians, like the prisoner I have referred to, are encouraged. They are an article with which they have little trouble, and out of which they can make both profit and capital. My own case was somewhat different. Once out of prison I was not likely to return, neither was I of the sort prison officials are accustomed to manage. Moreover, my eyes were open, and my future was not quite so certainly in their hands as to warrant them in feeling secure that what I saw might not hereafter be described for the information of others. The difficulties I experienced in gaining even the slightest concession were great, and contrast strangely with the case I have mentioned. A few months previous to my discharge from hospital, I gave in my name in the usual manner as being desirous to speak with the visiting director. I may here explain that there are 4 directors of convict prisons in England. One of them had the manners and the reputation of a gentleman. 2 of them may indeed have been men of ability, but their deportment to the convicts was certainly not calculated to give them any more exalted ideas than they already possessed of the civility and good manners obtaining amongst those above them. The 4th was the beau ideal of a bully, and his influence on the convict, the statistics of the prison will show to have been baneful in the extreme. The powers of these directors are much more extensive than that of the magistrates in our country prisons. In the latter, the visiting magistrate will ask the prisoners if they have any complaint to make, but this is not the case with the convict director, whom none can approach without giving formal notice, and who generally leaves the prison followed by the curses and maledictions of the majority of the prisoners. In reality, the prison director holds absolute sway over some thousands of his fellow men. There is no appeal from his decision. His court is held, and prisoners are sentenced and punished, but there are no reporters for the press. The wholesome influence of public opinion does not penetrate that secret and irresponsible tribunal. Such being the case, it is to be lamented that we cannot or do not find men to fill the office who are capable of discharging its duties with fairness and civility. Before I sought an interview with the director, I had written a letter to the late Mr. Cobden, in which, after narrating the particulars of my case, I expressed the hope that he might feel it consistent with his public duty to endeavour to procure for me the same treatment with reference to liberation as had been extended to other prisoners who had suffered the loss of a similar limb at the same prison before me. This was considered improper language, and the letter was suppressed. When called before the authorities on this occasion, I asked them to point out all the objectionable passages, in order that I might know what to omit in writing it another time, but this they would not do, and all the satisfaction I could get was that my letter might not only be shown to the Home Secretary, but also be noticed in the House of Commons, and that they might be blamed for passing it. The idea of my letter being noticed in the House of Commons was new and not very agreeable to me, but I also thought it very improbable that such would be the case, and remarked in reply that there was nothing in the letter that a prisoner could be justly blamed for writing, and that its publication could not have an injurious effect on the public interest. This was not denied, but the letter was suppressed nevertheless, and I presume still lies among many similar documents which have from time to time met with the same fate. On the morning following my application for an interview with the director, I was informed that I could not see him on that occasion, as he was expected that very day. This refusal appeared strange to me, inasmuch as I knew of other prisoners who were permitted to speak to the director who had not given in their names earlier than I did. There was nothing for it, however, but to wait patiently for another month, and to give in my name a second time, when I was permitted my first interview with a prison director. I remember it well. The director was seated at a desk in the governor's room, with the governor likewise seated at his desk. A large book lay on the desk in which the director wrote, or was supposed to write, what the prisoners requested or complained of, what punishments he awarded, with all the particulars regarding the offences, what answers he gave to complaints, requests, etc. Not a very trustworthy book that, I should say. In front of the desk stood two warders with staves in their hands, and between these two men I was placed. I asked the director very politely if he would be kind enough to look into my case and recommend me to the Home Secretary for the same lenience as had been extended to other 3 prisoners, who had each lost a leg in prison from disease shortly before me.
"No prisoners have lost their legs from disease. There was some accident connected with it."
This was the reply made to me, in a gruff, bullying tone of voice. I then begged his pardon, and commenced to give the names of the prisoners whose cases I had mentioned. But when the director saw that I was familiar with the cases he would not permit me to proceed, and refused peremptorily to look into my case. I then asked him to be kind enough to allow me to petition the Home Secretary on the merits of my case, as I petitioned the first time solely on the ground of having lost my leg, and being in bad health.
No, that will do. Call the next man."
And I was bundled out of the room, with the prayer on my lips that I might never more be compelled to speak to such a man. Convicts, I may add, are freely permitted to petition the Home Secretary every 12 months. At this time nearly 18 months had elapsed since I petitioned first. To show that I had some grounds for my request, I will mention the case of the prisoners who had lost limbs at the same prison shortly before me. A. Sentence nearly double mine. Crime, rape on his own daughter. He had only been a short time in prison when his leg required to be amputated, in consequence of disease in the knee joint. He was told by the doctor, before the operation, that he would be liberated on recovery. Patient died. B. A regular thief, with many previous convictions, lost a diseased limb, was offered his liberty by the authorities, and his licence was issued, but his father would not receive him. He ultimately died in prison. C. A French housebreaker who had been in English prisons before, sentenced 7 years, lost his leg in consequence of disease in the knee joint, and recovered speedily. He was sent home a few months after the operation, and before he had been so long in prison as I had been at the time of my request. I now felt rather unhappy under the severity with which I was treated, and wrote a letter to my brother, in which I mentioned having seen the visiting director, but this letter was also suppressed, and I was warned not to mention the director's name in any letter, or inform my friends of the suppressed letter to Mr. Cobden. I felt hurt at its suppression, for its spirit was most unobjectionable, and the governor seemed to think so too, for he allowed me a sheet of paper to write to the director. My object in this letter was to obtain permission to petition the Home Secretary for liberty to go abroad. At this time all healthy and sound prisoners of my age, who had received the same sentence, were about due for their ticket in Western Australia, and as I did not see why the loss of a leg should cause me to be kept in prison for years after they were liberated, I resolved to petition to go abroad. I accordingly wrote my letter to the director, carefully excluding any reference to my treatment in the government prison, as not to give any offence. An answer came back in suspicious haste, that I was to petition the Home Secretary in the very same language as I had used in the letter. I was not exactly pleased with this, as I wished to say something about the merits of my case, but there was no help for it, and I must petition as I was told, or not petition at all. I petitioned accordingly, in precisely the same language, merely using the third instead of the first person singular, but it was of no use. Indeed, I do not believe the petition was ever sent to the Secretary of State at all. All these documents go in the first instance to the directors, and they are understood to deal with them as they think proper. Sometimes their machinery gets out of order, and the method by which these things are done gets to be exposed. 2 cases where answers were received to petitions, which were never sent, are very familiar to the majority of convicts. In the one case the prisoner had drawn his paper, but delayed writing the petition. The reply came notwithstanding not sufficient grounds. In the other case the petition was discovered mislaid in the office, or some other part of the prison, after the prisoner had received his answer. The official replies to petitions appear to be stereotyped, and the names of the petitioners are merely written on the margin. One reply does for any number of petitions, and all the officials have to do is to write the name of the prisoner who draws petition paper on the margin of the answer, about a month after the paper has been issued. On the day I wrote the last petition I was discharged from the hospital, and transferred downstairs to a room containing 24 prisoners. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. The Prison, Daily Routine, Readings in Prison, Quarrels among the Prisoners, Protestants versus Catholics, School, Sundays in Prison, Sacrament Blokes, Turning Point in Prisoner's Career. My readers must now descend with me from the hospital to what the convicts termed the 24-bedded room in the prison. In the cells and in the hospital quietness reigned, but in the 24-bedded room it was different. Here the prisoners talked and conducted themselves very much as they felt inclined, and in the evenings the noise and tumult were sometimes beyond description. The inmates were constantly changing, some going upstairs to hospital, some coming from it, and every now and again there were fresh arrivals from other prisons. The daily routine observed here and in the similar wards was as follows. We started out of bed at 5:30 a.m., summer and winter, washed, dressed, and made our beds, and 2 or 3 times every week assisted in scrubbing the floor. At 6 o'clock the officer opened the room door and counted us. At 6:30 we had breakfast. About 20 minutes past 7 we were ranked up in the corridor and counted a second time. At 7:30 we were in chapel. At 8 o'clock we were on parade and counted a third time. Those who worked outside and were receiving full diet went to their work. Those who worked inside walked on the parade until 8:30. They were then ranked up and counted for the 4th time, and at 9 o'clock were all at work. At 11:45 we were counted for the 5th time, and at 12 o'clock we were at dinner. At 12:50 we were again ranked in the corridor and counted for the 6th time. At 1 o'clock we were on parade and counted for the 7th time, before exercise commenced. At 10 minutes after 2 we were counted for the 8th time, and at 2 we were all again at work. When we left off work in the evening, we were counted for the 9th time amongst the party with whom we worked, and for the 10th time when we returned to the ward. At 5:30 we got supper. At 7:30 we were ordered to bed. At 8 o'clock we were commanded to cease talking, and at 9 o'clock the night officer counted us for the 11th time, and left us to repose. I used to rejoice when bed time came, for I then could be alone and at home. There were no prison walls for me, for I had ceased brooding over the past, and endeavoured to peer into and prepare for the uncertain future. In winter and spring, when the weather was cold, it used to be rather trying for me to stand so long on parade being counted. About an hour or an hour and a half was spent in this way each day. Then the clothing of those of us who worked indoors was the same on the coldest day in winter as on the hottest day in summer. This was an excellent arrangement for keeping the hospital supplied with patients. I knew many who suffered from this cause, and some who attributed their death to the want of proper underclothing. I felt the cold more perhaps than the others, as my hands were exposed holding my crutches, and my speed in walking could never get beyond that of a goods train, whilst my companions could run at express speed when it suited them. My employment was knitting and reading aloud to the prisoners. At that time, and up to a very recent date, it was the custom where 50 or 100 prisoners were at work, for one of the prisoners to read aloud an hour every forenoon and afternoon. When I commenced this reading, my audience were very careless about listening, unless when I read some amusing work of fiction. Indeed, other prisoners did not attempt to read any book of a more solid description. But during the years I was engaged in this way I had the most abundant and satisfactory testimony that I had obtained an influence over the minds of the prisoners, and had succeeded in attracting their attention to general literature in a more effectual manner than any of my predecessors. My readers will have been accustomed, perhaps, to regard convicts as very ignorant men, but it must be borne in mind that they belong to all classes of society, and if I were to speak of them in the mass, I should say that they were much more intelligent and as well educated as the ordinary peasantry of England. When I commenced reading in prison, there were a good many works in the library, which were afterwards withdrawn as being too amusing for the place. These were works such as The Last Days of Pompey, Now and Then, Adam Bede, Poor Jack, Margaret Catchpole, Irving's Sketch Book, Dickens's Christmas Tales, etc. There still remained periodicals with tales in them, and these with a mixture of historical, biographical, and other works, constituted the general reading in the workrooms. The periodicals I note in the order of their popularity: Chambers' Journal, Leisure Hour, Good Words, The Quiver, Sunday Magazine, and Sunday at Home. The reading of an article in the Leisure Hour, entitled The Thief in the Confessional, was the chief cause of the readings being discontinued both in the workrooms and the hospital. As this happened recently, and the particulars are still fresh in my memory, I will narrate them here. There were readings aloud in 4 hospitals and 3 workrooms in the prison. In the hospital the Roman Catholics were kept by themselves and had a Roman Catholic reader. In the prison they were scattered among the Protestants, and in the 3 workrooms referred to, perhaps about 1/5 of the prisoners were Roman Catholics. In these rooms a Protestant reader was appointed, and there was no disturbance about this arrangement until the arrival of a few Fenians, and a zealous or rather an officious priest. Shortly after their arrival the other Roman Catholic prisoners became for the most part Fenians, and religious animosities soon sprang up among the prisoners. Macaulay's History of England was being read by one of my fellow prisoners, in one of the workrooms or sheds as they were called, when one of the ignorant and bigoted members of the Roman Catholic creed got up and objected to its being read, and complained to the governor on the subject. The governor, anxious perhaps to please the new visiting director, who was reported to be a Roman Catholic, took the complainant's part. The reading of the book was discontinued, to the great exultation of the Roman Catholics. However, I got the same book, and it was read from beginning to end in the workroom where I was employed, the chaplain and the more intelligent Roman Catholics considering it a very suitable book for the purpose. About this time I wished to be exempt from reading on account of my health, and when I could get a substitute I did give it up for some time, but the substitute available were not popular with the prisoners, and it was very difficult to find suitable readers amongst them. Two of the Roman Catholics wanted to read. One was a Fenian and a literary man, the other was an ignorant, conceited, professional thief, and an avowed infidel, but they were not allowed. Meanwhile the article I have referred to as appearing in the Leisure Hour was read in one of the sheds, and it so offended some of the Roman Catholics and the professional thief and infidel who was not allowed to read, that he took the matter before the director, who ordered all reading aloud to be discontinued throughout the prison. This decision illustrates the usual method adopted by convict authorities in dealing with questions connected with the treatment of prisoners. If a privilege is granted to the convicts and one out of 600 abuses that privilege the 599 will be deprived of it. It was no matter whether the privilege had a good or bad effect upon the majority of the prisoners. If it gave the governor and the directors any trouble, they soon put an end to it. If it was a good thing for the prisoners and tended in any way towards the diminution of crime to have these readings, the director could have separated the Roman Catholics from the Protestants without any difficulty. If it was a bad thing, then why was it continued so long? The Roman Catholics had one legitimate ground of complaint, however, in the chaplain having frequently ordered articles to be cut out of Chambers' Journal, Good Words, etc. The prisoners naturally asked, why cut out anything? Why not let us judge for ourselves? If the books are good, let us have them whole; if bad, reject them altogether. Or if there is to be cutting out, why not cut out the thief out of the confessional, which is so offensive to the true Catholic? I happened to read several of the articles which were so cut out, and in several cases one number of a periodical got bound up and in circulation with the condemned article in it. I here note a few articles which were placed in the chaplain's Index Expurgatorium. First, Evasions of the Law, an article which appeared in Good Words, and I may remark that convicts could scarcely be made worse by reading it, for they knew all it contained, and probably more than the writer of it did. Second, a review of a work by a female warder, in Chambers' Journal. Third, the last half of The Franklins, a story in the Leisure Hour. Fourth, an article on the Prisoners' Aid Society, which appeared in the Quiver some years ago. In addition to my employments of knitting and reading, I had to go to school one half day every week for about 12 months, or until a certain class were exempt from attending. On entering the school the prisoner sat until the roll was called, and after half an hour was thus spent. He read a couple of verses from the Old Testament, and then listened to an explanation of the passage read. This done, he wrote a short time in his copy book, if he felt inclined, and the proceedings were wound up by a short lecture on some scientific subject. I fear there is not much good done in our convict schools. teaching or trying to teach men ranging from 30 to 80 years of age, who are determined not to learn, or at least so careless about the matter that they never can learn, seems to me a waste of public money. Young men sometimes learn a good deal of French, arithmetic, etc. in prison, but it is not at the school, but from their fellow prisoners that they receive such instruction. My Sunday routine differed from that of the other days of the week, chiefly in having chapel going substituted for work, and being allowed to be in bed an hour longer in the morning. Shortly after taking up my abode in the 24-bedded room, the diet was changed, and this was the cause of much noise among the convicts. The day fixed for the alteration was a Sunday. The former Sunday's dinner consisted of soup, mutton, and potatoes. The new Sunday dinner was dry bread and 4 ounces of bad cheese. On being served with this, the prisoners began cursing and swearing, and calling the head officials all the bad names they could think of. This is what they call Christianity, is it? The hypocrites! Starving a man on Sundays above all days, and then taking us up to that chapel to tell us about mercy and forgiveness and loving our neighbours. This is the way to reform us and make us better, is it? By jingo! I will make somebody pay for all this yet. I will not get my next bit for nothing, etc., etc. Such was the burden of their conversation on this and succeeding Sunday afternoons. To force men to go to hear the word of God preached when their hearts are full of evil thoughts and their mouths full of curses is far from being a likely mode of leading men to Christ. The chaplain's position in the pulpit used to strike me as being something like that of a farmer sowing good seed broadcast over a field so overgrown with tares that the seed could never reach the soil. If he attempts to clear the soil of the weeds, to win the hearts of the prisoners, he finds the whole system of prison discipline arrayed against him. That discipline breeds and encourages the growth of every evil passion in the heart of man, and he, the chaplain, is part of that system. He lives by it, and he is not allowed to interfere with it. At all events he never did so. When prisoners complained to him of some injustice or some cruelty, they got for reply, "I am here to preach the gospel, and I can do nothing in the matter." Chaplains paid by the state, and forming part of the penal establishment, can never do much good to the prisoners, except in so far as they operate as a check upon the cruelty or neglect of the governor and other officers. Missionaries having no connection with government might do some good amongst them. At the time I commenced to attend the prison chapel, I learned that a score or so of convicts took the sacrament. Some of them were truly pious, as far as one could judge in such matters. Others were unfit or unworthy partakers. The whole of them were called by the other prisoners parsons' men, or sacrament blokes, and it used to pain me to hear them scoffed and mocked at. It was a great victory if they could be got to swear on the evening of the communion day. I never could make up my mind to become a parson's man, for reasons perhaps not very satisfactory even to myself. In the first place I belonged to another branch of the church. Then I had only one leg and could not kneel at the altar, and would have felt while standing something like a beggar in dirty rags in a fine pew among silks and satins. Then again I would have lost my influence over many of my fellow prisoners. I may have been wrong in all this, but as I once said to my fellow prisoners when appealed to on the subject of religion, there are only 3 cardinal points in my religious belief, and these are simple and easily remembered: believe in Christ, love God, and love my neighbour. What I do inconsistent with the last I know to be wrong. It is inconsistent, I think, with the latter for Protestants to revile and speak evil of Roman Catholics and vice versa. Therefore I disapprove of discussions and arguments on religious belief among prisoners, as they usually lead to feelings incompatible with true neighbourly love. Such was my reply to a question addressed to me by a convict during a hot debate between the Protestants and Roman Catholics, and it allayed the storm instantly. As a rule I avoided and discountenanced all discussion on theological subjects. After I had been 4 weeks in the prison, I began to get a little downhearted at finding myself so far removed from sympathy. In the hospital I had an occasional chat with a scripture reader, but here there was no one with whom I could have any intellectual conversation, and no visitors were allowed. I felt very sad and dispirited for a time, and wrote to my friends that I should like to have a visit from a clergyman of my own persuasion who resided in London. I got for a reply a visit from some of my own friends, who mentioned that the gentleman whose visit I desired was too much occupied with his own flock to look after a lost sheep like me. I noticed this chiefly in order to remark that this was the kind of turning point in my prison career, the point at which the generality of prisoners turn from bad to worse, and when long imprisonment ceases to be an instrument for good. When human sympathy is sought, and by the great majority of prisoners sought in vain, and when in consequence they seek to obtain the sympathy of their evil companions, and begin in earnest that downward career which knows no shame, and finds its goal in the convict's grave. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of 6 Years in the Prisons of England, by a Merchant, edited by Frank Henderson. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Indiscriminate association of prisoners, transportation, and the cause of its failure. A gunsmith. As I have already said in a previous chapter, one of the most glaring defects in our prison system of penal servitude, viewed as a means of reformation as well as of punishment, is the indiscriminate association of all classes of criminals, or rather all criminals with a certain sentence, irrespective of the nature of the crime they have committed. The previous character of the criminal, or the probability of his readmission into society as an honest and useful member of it. I have met in the same ward prisoners of widely different characters and antecedents, whose crimes afforded conclusive proofs that in habits, disposition, and general conduct they would never, in the natural order of things, become associates, compelled by law to mate with each other as equals, and to learn of each other how to injure, not to benefit society and themselves. There are, for instance, certain crimes which a man may commit under the influence of strong passions, aroused in moments of great temptation, such as rape, or of great provocation, such as manslaughter, or committed under the pressure of misfortune, or to avoid impending ruin, such as forgery or embezzlement, which do not necessarily prove the criminal to be of habitually depraved habits, or generally of a violent and vicious disposition. I found as a rule prisoners guilty of these crimes undergoing their first sentences. Prison life and prison associations were new to them as to me. They had no inclination to repeat the offence, or to pursue a career of crime, but rather disposed to redeem their character, and live an honest and industrious life. Yet this class of prisoners are condemned, in addition to the loss of liberty and character, to live in constant contact, for years it may be, with the professional thief and housebreaker, the burglar and the garotter, who has been frequently convicted, and whose whole life is spent between the prison and the cross. the natural and inevitable result of this contamination. Even in the case of men possessing high principle and of great moral fortitude, the effect would be deteriorating and pernicious. With men of weak resolution, strong passions, and a comparatively low standard of morality, the consequences cannot be doubtful in the majority of cases. They gradually lose self-respect, cease to think of reformation or amendment. In time they come to envy the hardened stoicism and gameness of the practised ruffian, learn his language, imbibe his notions of life, and finally resolve, since character, self-respect, and all else that bind them to the morality and virtue are lost, that they will compel society to make amends for the ruin it has brought upon them. It is from this class I am persuaded that the ranks of our born and bred convicts are so largely and so constantly supplemented. Yet how easily and how speedily might this resource of supply be diminished, if not altogether closed. The old Transportation Act, although it may not have provided for any such separation as that I have just indicated, and although it was based on what I consider pernicious principles, was undoubtedly the most effectual plan for getting rid of our criminal population, and in its operation the most merciful to the prisoner of any of our recent parliamentary enactments. Had its provisions been effectively and judiciously administered, we might still have been sending convicts to our colonies. But the business of exporting our dirty linen was grossly mismanaged. The merchant who hopes to succeed as an exporter must study carefully the class of goods suitable for the market he proposes to supply, and send only those he is confident will be approved of and meet a ready sale. But our prison authorities, by some fatality, so organised the system of selection of convicts for transportation that those who were, of all men, the very last a young and virtuous community would seek, were forced upon them, whilst those for whom there was a constant demand, and who would have regarded transportation and liberation abroad as the opportunity for escaping from a social prejudice, of retrieving their lost character, and of commencing anew a life of honesty and industry, were condemned to pine in the prisons at home, and in too many cases to adopt a career of crime when their sentence expired. The first and great commandment the prison authorities regarded in their selection was, that the prisoner should be physically healthy, sound in wind and limb, and the second was, that he should have been a certain time in prison at home after receiving his last sentence, and conducted himself well whilst there. No inquiry was made into the prisoner's previous history, employment, education, or general disposition and habits, which one would naturally have thought necessary before any intelligent opinion could be formed as to the probabilities of his future career abroad. Now, although the qualifications of health and good conduct might seem to be good and sufficient grounds on which to make such a selection as was required for transportation, those acquainted with prisoners and prison life will at once perceive that they were very far from being so. In the first place, a great many of the prisoners who would have adopted an honest life and been a benefit to the colonies if they had been sent there, but who were rejected on account of ill health, had become diseased in prison and in consequence of their imprisonment, and would in all probability have recovered their usual good health before they had reached their destination abroad. These were generally men of education and accustomed to generous diet, but the prison discipline and scale of dietary soon told upon their health, and disqualified them in the eyes of the prison officials for the boon of transportation, even if their health was not restored by the sea voyage and liberation abroad. It was only exchanging the hospital abroad for the hospital at home. If the experiment succeeded, who may estimate its value to him who was the subject of it? Again, good conduct, as indicated by the standard of our prison authorities, is anything but a trustworthy criterion of the convict's true character and disposition. It does not mean that the prisoner has shown himself honest, industrious, or well disposed, or in any active sense what the phrase is ordinarily supposed to mean. Indeed, the system of penal servitude does not permit the prisoner any opportunity of showing that he is so. All that good conduct in prison official language means is, that the prisoner has not broken any of the prison rules, and is thereby a purely negative quality. Scrupulous obedience to prison discipline and regulations, with severe penalties attached to transgression, is a very sorry basis on which to found a character of good conduct in a convict. The consequence was, if one of the greatest ruffians that ever entered the prison gates were to make up his mind, as I have known many of them do, to go abroad, he knew that he had only to study the rules of the prison and obey them for a certain length of time, and he would obtain his object, and be let loose among the innocent colonists, to rob and murder as he found opportunity. Thousands of such men, who had purposely behaved themselves well in the prisons at home, with the grim determination of making amends for their restraint by a career of increased violence and ruffianism abroad, were thus let loose among colonial society, and there is no wonder that the colonies rose up in indignation and shut their ports against them. As a rule, it was the hardened criminal whose reformation under existing laws was, I may safely say, entirely out of the question, who, on the score of health and good conduct, most perfectly fulfilled the conditions required by the prison authorities, and most frequently had the boon of transportation extended to him. Accustomed by long and frequent experience to prison diet and discipline, and to all the dodges for argumenting the one and evading or modifying the other, he could keep himself in perfect health under circumstances which would send a less experienced and more sensitive man to the hospital in a month, whilst his familiarity with all the petty rules and regulations of the prison, which the novice is in constant danger of breaking, quite unintentionally, enabled him to steer clear of any offence that could be reported if he thought it for his interest to strive for the convict's prize. In fact, good conduct, as exemplified by a convict according to the prison standard, affords no more reliable evidence of his moral qualities and industrious habits than proficiency in drill affords of the moral character of the private soldier. It is quite clear that selection on these terms could only by a rare accident find the suitable men for sending abroad, and yet it is my firm conviction that I, or any other man possessing ordinary intelligence and insight into human character and experience of convict life, could with the utmost ease have selected from the inmates of our prisons a very large number for exportation, whom our colonists would have been glad to receive, and who would have been rescued from a life of ignominy or crime at home. The question may very naturally be asked, why could not our prison officials have done the same? The only answer I can give is that our prison officials, excepting the very highest, are directly interested in maintaining and increasing, and not in reducing, the number of our convicts, and they are therefore inclined to favour the liberation of those whom they are pretty sure will soon return. As a fair and forcible example of the advantage which might have been taken of the Transportation Act in dealing with a certain class of prisoners, and also as an illustration not nearly so forcible as others I have alluded to, and will yet notice, of the fault of the authorities in the matter of selection. I will mention one case. 3 young men received sentence of 20 years penal servitude for rape. One of them, quite a youth, was more a spectator of than a principal in the crime, the other 2 being the really guilty parties. The 3 were in due course sent to Portsmouth. The guilty pair were sent abroad and liberated before the end of 5 years from the date of their conviction. One of them is now married and settled comfortably abroad, and the other lodges with him. The other prisoner, being young and not very muscular, received some injury while at work and was sent to the Invalid Criminal Hospital in Surrey, and has to remain in prison, in a state useless to himself and to society, for 8 or 9 years longer than his more guilty companions. But the day has gone by for successful re-establishment of a penal colony. I do not think there are many who would commit crimes for the express purpose of getting abroad, unless the colony was very attractive, but no country where officers can be got to reside will ever be looked upon with dread by the majority of criminals. A penal colony, I am convinced, would have no deterring influence on the minds of those convicts who are most difficult to deal with. It would have such an effect upon certain classes of prisoners, but their numbers are small, and less expensive remedies might be found even more effectual in their cases. When convicts leave prison, they could be divided into 3 classes. First, those men who are not only determined to live honestly, but who in all human probability will never enter a prison. Their number may amount to about 10% of the whole. Another class leave prison with the deliberate intention of committing crime, and their number may be about 40%. The third class, comprising about 50% of the whole, belong to the hesitating, unsteady, wavering class. Many of this class do manage to keep out of prison, but at least 1/2 of them return, and along with the 40% of professionals bring up the number of the reconvicted to 70 per year. Now it must be quite clear that if we would reduce this number, it is to the 50% of waverers that our efforts must be principally directed. The other classes either do not require or will not benefit by our endeavours. Our present law is altogether unable to cure the professional thief. I never heard and never met with a convict who ever heard of any of this class being converted into honest men by the operation of our present system, nor do I believe it possible to point to a single case. The professional thief lacks 3 virtues: economy, industry, honesty. Now, under the present system, it is positively forbidden to give him any practical lesson either in economy or honesty. Industry, indeed, might be taught him, but he rarely, if ever, receives an intelligent lesson, for it must be remembered that enforced labour does not teach the labourer industry, but is more likely to inspire him with an aversion to it. All that can be done with the professional thief under existing laws, beyond the punishment of confinement and vigorous prison discipline, possibly is to give him such work to do as he can do, or be readily taught to do, and that work not to be of the kind usually done in prison, but such as will compensate to some extent for his maintenance in prison, and enable him to live honestly out of it should he so elect. On my right hand, in the 24-bedded room, lay a city-bred professional thief, acquainted with all the brothels and sinks of iniquity in London, and his disgusting conversation chiefly related to such places. Like many of his class, his constitution was delicate, and his appetite somewhat dainty. The prison fare and hard work were undoubtedly severe punishment to him, but no punishment could frighten him into honesty. He knew no honest trade by which he could support himself, but if he had been taught one in prison such as suited his strength and talents, and had been taught only the policy of honesty, and been then sent to a country far removed from his old haunts, where his newly organised trade would be more profitable than thieving, the possibility is he would have become a useful man in the world. On the expiration of his sentence, which was 3 years, he went home and wrote back to one of his pals in prison, under an assumed name, that he had been to the Prisoners' Aid Society, and had obtained as much of his gratuity as he could, to buy a barrow and some fruit, as he meant to turn costermonger. He added, however, that he did not like fruit selling, and returned to his old trade of gunsmith, gunning being the slang term for thieving or going on the cross. The real fact was that he never intended anything else than being a gunsmith, but only used the deception in order to obtain a little more money from the Aid Society than he otherwise could. As soon as he got his barrow and stock he sold off all, and in a very few months I had him for a companion again, with a 7 years' sentence. I remember asking whether he preferred a sentence of 7 years penal servitude or 3 years in Coldbath Fields.
3 years in Coldbath Fields? Why, that would kill me. I would as soon have 15 years here.
The only good trait discoverable in his character was his ardent affection for his mother. When he has completed about 5 years and 3 months, he will be liberated again, if he is alive, and again he will return to crime, and it is almost impossible that such a man can do otherwise, and as long as our prison authorities regard convicts as mere living automatons, all modelled after the same fashion in iniquity, our convict and county prisons, viewed as reformatories, will remain quite inoperative for good, but very potent for evil. Chapter 11.